Hey guys, did you know that a lot of you who watch my videos aren't subscribed yet? I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below. Your interaction really helps the channel grow and allows more people to see my content. Thanks so much for your support. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of Glacier National Park, casting long shadows across the pristine landscape. A fiery sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that belied the hidden dangers lurking within the park's untamed wilderness. Amidst this breathtaking scenery, Ranger Alex Jensen stood on the observation deck of the Apgar Visitor Center, his gaze fixed on the rugged terrain. A seasoned veteran with a weathered face and keen eyes, Jensen had dedicated his life to protecting this wild paradise. Years of experience had instilled in him a deep respect for the park's untamed beauty and its unpredictable inhabitants. But beneath his calm exterior, a lingering fear gnawed at him, a chilling reminder of a past encounter with a grizzly bear that nearly cost him his life. A young couple approached, their faces etched with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Excuse me, Ranger," the woman began, her voice trembling slightly. "We heard there's been some unusual animal activity lately. Is it safe to hike the Eyeline Trail tomorrow?" Jensen met their gaze, his expression a careful blend of reassurance and caution. "Glacier is a wild place, folks," he replied, his voice steady and calm. "There's always a certain level of risk when venturing into the backcountry. But we haven't had any confirmed reports of dangerous wildlife encounters recently." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "However," he continued, "we have received some reports of unusual animal activity in the northern section of the park. We're currently investigating, and we'll be sure to post any updates on the trailhead kiosks and our website." As the couple thanked him and moved on, Jensen's radio crackled to life. "Ranger Jensen, this is Ramirez. I'm at the Mini Glacier campground. You better come take a look at this." Jensen recognized the voice of Ranger Sarah Ramirez, a recent transfer from Saguaro National Park. Ramirez was a skilled tracker and wilderness expert, eager to prove herself in this new environment. He had been impressed by her enthusiasm and dedication, but also sensed a hint of overconfidence that sometimes came with inexperience. With a sense of foreboding, Jensen made his way to the campground. What he found there would send a chill down his spine and set in motion a chain of events that would test his courage and push him to his limits. The scene at the Mini Glacier campground was one of chaos and fear. A tent lay ripped and shredded, its contents scattered across the trampled ground. Backpacks had been torn open, food containers gnawed and emptied. A sense of unease hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Ranger Ramirez stood amidst the wreckage, her face pale but determined. "It happened just before dawn," she explained, her voice tight with apprehension. "The campers said they woke to the sound of something tearing through their tent. They managed to scare it off, but not before it caused quite a bit of damage." Jensen surveyed the scene, his trained eye taking in every detail. The sheer force required to inflict such damage was impressive. This was no ordinary animal. He crouched down, examining the tracks imprinted in the soft earth. Deep claw marks and an unusually wide gait pointed towards a formidable predator. "Wolverine," he muttered, more to himself than to Ramirez. "But that's impossible. They're incredibly rare in this part of the park." Ramirez nodded, her brow furrowed. "I know. But the tracks are unmistakable. And the aggressive behavior, it's consistent with a wolverine, especially one that's desperate or injured." A knot of worry tightened in Jensen's stomach. Wolverines were known for their ferocity and tenacity. Pound for pound, they were one of the most powerful predators in North America. If a wolverine was indeed responsible for this attack, it posed a serious threat to the park's visitors. Jensen and Ramirez spent the next few hours meticulously documenting the scene. They collected samples of hair and scat, photographed the tracks, and interviewed the shaken campers. The campers, a young couple from California, were still visibly shaken but thankfully unarmed. They described the creature as a shadowy beast with glowing eyes and a ferocious growl. Back at the ranger station, Jensen and Ramirez pored over maps and wildlife reports. They consulted with a wildlife biologist who confirmed their suspicions. Recent wildfires in the Flathead National Forest had likely driven a wolverine out of its territory and into Glacier National Park. The biologist also mentioned a disturbing possibility. The wolverine might be suffering from mange, a skin disease that could cause increased aggression and unpredictable behavior. The news of a potential wolverine attack spread like wildfire through the park's headquarters. Rangers gathered around maps, discussing the situation with a mix of concern and excitement. Jensen and Ramirez presented their findings, emphasizing the need for immediate action to ensure public safety. "We need to get the word out," Jensen stated firmly. "Close off the trails in the affected area and post warnings at all the visitor centers and campgrounds." Ramirez nodded in agreement. "We should also consider issuing a press release. The media attention might help keep people vigilant." The park superintendent, a seasoned administrator named John Davis, weighed their recommendations. "I agree that public safety is our top priority," he said. "But we also need to avoid unnecessary panic. Let's start with targeted closures and warnings. We can escalate if necessary." Within hours, signs were posted along the Going to the Sun Road, the park's iconic scenic highway, and at popular trailheads like Logan Pass, Hidden Lake Trail, and Avalanche Lake Trail. Rangers were dispatched to patrol the backcountry, advising hikers and campers to be cautious and report any unusual sightings. Jensen and Ramirez took the lead in educating the public, distributing flyers with information about wolverines and safety tips. They emphasized the importance of staying alert, making noise while hiking, and properly storing food to avoid attracting wildlife. Despite their efforts, a sense of unease settled over the park. Visitors whispered about the Glacier Ghost, a name the media had quickly coined for the elusive wolverine. Hikers moved in groups, their eyes scanning the treeline for any sign of movement. The park's usual tranquility was replaced by an undercurrent of fear. Meanwhile, Jensen and Ramirez continued their investigation. They followed fresh tracks, analyzed scat samples, and set up camera traps in hopes of capturing an image of the wolverine. But the creature remained elusive, a phantom haunting the wilderness. Days turned into nights, and still, the wolverine remained elusive. The tension in Glacier National Park thickened like the morning mist that clung to the valleys. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent shivers down the spines of hikers and campers. The park, once a sanctuary of peace and natural beauty, now held an undercurrent of fear. Jensen and Ramirez felt the pressure mounting. They knew it was only a matter of time before the Wolverine struck again. The question was, where? And would they be able to prevent it? Despite the closures and warnings, some visitors couldn't resist the allure of Glacier's wild interior. A group of experienced backpackers, eager to escape the crowds and explore the park's less traveled trails, ventured deep into the backcountry, ignoring the rangers' advisories. Among them was a seasoned hiker named Mark, a man who prided himself on his wilderness skills and his ability to navigate the most challenging terrain. He led his friends with confidence, assuring them that their experience and preparedness would keep them safe. As they trekked through a dense forest, following a faint trail marked only by cairns, a sense of unease settled over the group. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional call of a distant bird. Even Mark, with his years of experience, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Then, it happened. A flash of movement in the undergrowth, a low growl that echoed through the trees. The Wolverine, its eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger, emerged from the shadows. The backpackers froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Mark, instinctively reaching for the bear spray attached to his backpack, fumbled with the safety clip. The Wolverine, sensing their fear, lunged forward, its jaws snapping. Chaos erupted. Screams pierced the air as the hikers scattered, their carefully planned formation dissolving into a panicked scramble for safety. Mark, finally managing to release the bear spray, aimed it at the Wolverine and fired. The bear spray had its intended effect. The Wolverine, momentarily blinded and disoriented, retreated into the dense undergrowth. But the damage was done. One of the hikers, a young woman named Emily, lay on the ground, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The Wolverine's claws had raked across her calf, leaving a deep, bloody gash. Mark, his hands trembling, knelt beside Emily, his mind racing. He had taken a wilderness first aid course, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He applied pressure to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, but the blood continued to flow. The other hikers huddled around, their faces etched with fear and helplessness. They were miles from the nearest trailhead, with no cell service and limited supplies. Their only hope was to reach their satellite phone, which they had left at their campsite a few miles back. Mark, leaving Emily in the care of his friends, set off at a desperate run, his mind filled with a chilling realization they were not alone in this wilderness. The Wolverine was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Back at the ranger station, Jensen and Ramirez received the distress call. Their hearts sank as they listened to the frantic voice on the other end of the line. They immediately mobilized a search and rescue team, dispatching a helicopter to the coordinates provided by the hikers. The helicopter soared over the rugged landscape, its rotors beating against the silence of the wilderness. Jensen and Ramirez, their faces grim, scanned the terrain below, searching for any sign of the injured hiker and her companions. The clock was ticking. Emily's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and the approaching darkness threatened to complicate the rescue effort. Jensen and Ramirez knew that every minute counted. They had to find the Ikers before it was too late. As the helicopter circled the designated coordinates, a break in the dense canopy of trees revealed a small clearing. There, huddled together beside a makeshift campfire, were the remaining hikers. Relief washed over Jensen and Ramirez as they spotted them, but the sight of Emily, pale and still, lying on a makeshift stretcher, sent a surge of urgency through them. The helicopter descended cautiously, its powerful downdraft sending leaves and branches swirling. Jensen, securing himself with a harness, leaned out of the open door, guiding the pilot towards a safe landing zone. A paramedic, part of the search and rescue team, jumped out of the helicopter before the blades had even stopped rotating. He rushed towards Emily, his practiced eyes assessing her condition. The gash on her leg was deep, but the bleeding had slowed thanks to the makeshift tourniquet applied by her companions. Working quickly, the paramedic administered pain medication and stabilized Emily's leg. He reassured her with a calm voice and a gentle touch, his presence a beacon of hope in the midst of fear and uncertainty. With Emily stabilized, the rescue team prepared to airlift her to the nearest hospital. Jensen and Ramirez helped load her onto a stretcher, carefully maneuvering it through the tight space of the helicopter cabin. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Emily towards safety, a collective sigh of relief escaped the remaining hikers. But the danger wasn't over yet. Jensen and Ramirez, staying behind with the hikers, couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The Wolverine, they knew, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, its presence a constant reminder of the wildness that surrounded them. With nightfall approaching, they gathered firewood and reinforced their campsite, creating a perimeter of light and noise to deter any unwanted visitors. They shared stories and whispered reassurances, trying to keep their fear at bay. But beneath the surface, adrenaline coursed through their veins, keeping them on high alert. The following morning, with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees, Jensen and Ramirez resumed their investigation. They carefully examined the scene of the attack, searching for any clues that might lead them to the Wolverine's lair. Ramirez, with her expertise in tracking, pointed out subtle signs that others might have missed: the direction of the Wolverine's tracks, the depth of its paw prints, the disturbed vegetation that indicated its path. She collected samples of scat, noting its size, consistency, and contents, hoping to glean insights into the animal's diet and health. Back at the ranger station, they consulted with a wildlife biologist, Dr. Emily Carter, an expert on wolverine behavior and ecology. Dr. Carter analyzed the scat samples, confirming that the wolverine was indeed suffering from mange, a skin disease that could explain its heightened aggression. Mange can cause intense itching and irritation, Dr. Carter explained, making animals more irritable and prone to attack. It can also weaken them, making it harder to hunt their usual prey. Jensen and Ramirez pieced together the evidence, forming a clearer picture of the wolverine's situation. Driven from its territory by wildfires, suffering from a debilitating disease, and struggling to find food, the wolverine was desperate. Its attacks were not merely acts of aggression, but a desperate struggle for survival. This wolverine isn't just a mindless predator, Jensen realized. It's a creature in pain, fighting for its life. This realization shifted their perspective. They no longer saw the wolverine as a mere threat to be eliminated, but as a complex creature deserving of compassion. They began to consider alternative solutions, ways to protect both the park's visitors and the wolverine itself. The revelation of the wolverine's plight sparked a heated debate among the park rangers. Some argue for immediate lethal action, citing the ongoing threat to public safety. Others, influenced by Jensen and Ramirez's findings, advocated for a more compassionate approach. "We can't just kill it," Ramirez argued passionately. "This animal is suffering. We have a responsibility to find a solution that protects both humans and wildlife." Jensen, drawing on his years of experience, proposed a risky but potentially rewarding solution: capture and relocation. "If we can trap the wolverine and its young," he explained, "we can relocate them to a remote area where they won't pose a threat to visitors." The park superintendent, John Davis, listened intently to the arguments, weighing the risks and benefits of each option. He recognized the ethical dilemma they faced: the need to protect human life versus the responsibility to preserve the park's wildlife. After careful deliberation, he made a decision. "We'll attempt a capture and relocation," he announced, "but we'll proceed with extreme caution. The safety of our rangers and visitors remains our top priority." The team sprang into action, preparing a large live trap designed to capture the wolverine without causing it harm. They baited the trap with the scent of the wolverine's favorite food, hoping to lure it in. They also consulted with experts on tranquilizer darts, ensuring they had the right dosage and equipment to safely sedate the animal if necessary. The operation was fraught with risk. Wolverines were notoriously strong and cunning, capable of escaping even the most secure traps. And if cornered or threatened, they could become extremely aggressive. But Jensen and Ramirez were determined to give this plan a chance. Days turned into weeks, and the trap remained empty. The wolverine, despite its weakened condition, proved to be cunning and elusive. Jensen and Ramirez began to doubt their strategy, wondering if they had underestimated their adversary. Then, one crisp morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the valley, the signal came. The trap had been sprung. Jensen and Ramirez, their hearts pounding with anticipation, rushed to the site, accompanied by a veterinarian and a team of experienced rangers. As they approached the trap, they heard a low growl emanating from within. The wolverine, caught in the cage, paced restlessly, its eyes burning with a mixture of fear and defiance. The rangers, armed with tranquilizer guns, moved cautiously, aware of the potential danger. Dr. Carter, the veterinarian, took the lead, her voice calm and reassuring. "We need to sedate it before we can move the trap," she explained. "It's important to minimize stress on the animal." With steady hands, she aimed the tranquilizer dart and fired. The dart hit its mark, and the wolverine, momentarily stunned, slumped to the floor of the cage. But as the rangers moved in to secure the trap, the wolverine suddenly sprang to life, its powerful muscles propelling it against the cage door. The door, weakened by the impact, buckled outward, creating a small opening. Before anyone could react, the wolverine squeezed through the gap, its claws slashing at the nearest ranger. Jensen, reacting instinctively, tackled the creature, wrestling it to the ground. A fierce struggle ensued, man against beast, in the heart of the wilderness. Jensen, drawing on his strength and experience, managed to pin the wolverine down, but not without cost. Its claws raked across his arm, leaving deep, bloody wounds. Ramirez, seeing Jensen's predicament, rushed to his aid, firing another tranquilizer dart. This time, the dart took full effect, and the wolverine finally succumbed to the sedative. With the wolverine safely sedated, the rangers carefully transported it to a remote wilderness area far from the park's main trails and campgrounds. They chose a location with abundant prey and suitable habitat, hoping to give the animal the best chance of survival. Dr. Carter, the veterinarian, monitored the wolverine's recovery, ensuring it was healthy and strong enough to be released. She treated its mange, providing medication and care to alleviate its suffering. As the wolverine regained its strength, Jensen and Ramirez couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the creature's resilience. They had witnessed its ferocity, its desperation, and its vulnerability. They had come to understand that its actions, though dangerous, were driven by instinct and a primal need to survive. This experience has changed my perspective, Ramirez admitted, gazing at the wolverine as it explored its new surroundings. We often see wildlife as either a threat or a spectacle. But they're so much more than that. They're complex creatures, just trying to navigate their world. Jensen nodded in agreement. We have a responsibility to protect both humans and wildlife, he said. But we also need to respect the wildness that makes this park so special. We need to find a balance, a way to coexist with these creatures without compromising their freedom or our safety. News of the wolverine's successful relocation spread through the park, replacing fear with a sense of relief and renewed appreciation for the park's wild inhabitants. Jensen and Ramirez were hailed as heroes, their courage and compassion celebrated by visitors and colleagues alike. The incident served as a reminder of the delicate balance between humans and nature. It sparked a renewed commitment to conservation and education, inspiring visitors to learn more about the park's wildlife and to respect the wildness that surrounded them. And as the sun set over Glacier National Park, casting a golden glow on the majestic peaks, the wolverine, now a symbol of resilience and the untamed spirit of the wilderness, vanished into the shadows, its legacy etched in the hearts of those who had crossed its path. An appreciation for the natural world. The Appalachian Trail stretched out before us like an endless green serpent, winding its way through the dense forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, dappling the trail in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Emily and I, backpacks strapped tight, took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, a sense of anticipation and excitement hanging heavy in the air. Ready for an adventure? I asked, grinning at Emily. She smiled back, a hint of nervousness in her eyes. As I'll ever be. Just promise me we won't get lost. Lost? I scoffed playfully. With my expert navigation skills? Never. I pulled out my phone, snapping a quick picture of us with the trailhead sign in the background. Last chance for selfies and social media, I announced, because we're officially off the grid. Emily laughed, tucking her phone away. Good riddance. Time to disconnect and reconnect with nature. We set off with a spring in our step, the weight of our worries and the city fading away with every step. The trail was well maintained, a clear path through the towering trees. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath our boots, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the steady rhythm of our own breathing. It was exactly the kind of escape we needed. A chance to leave behind the stress of work and school, to trade in the concrete jungle for the serenity of the wilderness. We were two souls seeking solace in the embrace of nature, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beyond the trail's edge. We hiked for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The trail gradually became steeper, the air thinner, and the forest more dense. We paused for a water break, leaning against a moss-covered boulder, our muscles already starting to ache. "This view is incredible," Emily said, gazing out at the rolling hills that stretched out before us. "But I think we should stick to the main trail. Remember what that park ranger said about unmarked trails?" I shrugged, already scanning the map. He was probably just being overly cautious. Besides, look at this. I pointed to a faint dotted line on the map. There's a shortcut that leads to an even better vista point. It'll add a couple of hours to our hike, but it'll be worth it. Emily hesitated, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure about this, Alex? It looks pretty overgrown." "Relax," I reassured her, slinging my backpack back on. "We've got plenty of daylight left, and I've got my compass and GPS. We won't get lost." Despite her reservations, Emily followed me as I veered off the main trail, plunging into the thick undergrowth. The air grew cooler and damper, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy of leaves. The path was barely discernible, a narrow track barely wide enough for us to walk side by side. "This is kind of creepy," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of leaves. "Just a little off the beaten path," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "That's where the real adventure lies." But as we ventured deeper into the woods, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant caw of a crow. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The sunlight, already muted by the dense canopy, seemed to dim even further, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and twisted around us. The air grew thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "This is starting to feel a bit weird," Emily said, her voice hushed. "Don't you think it's too quiet?" I tried to shrug off her concerns. "Maybe the animals are just taking a siesta," I joked, though my own unease was growing. We continued on, the silence amplifying every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. Then, we saw it, a flash of movement in the undergrowth, too quick to identify. A shiver ran down my spine. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "Probably just a deer," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The movement had been too fluid, too deliberate for a deer. We pressed on, our pace quickening. The trail, or what remained of it, was becoming increasingly difficult to follow. Thorns snagged at our clothes, and fallen branches blocked our path. The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the back of my neck. Suddenly, Emily gasped, pointing to a tree trunk ahead. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a crudely drawn circle with a cross inside. It looked ancient, weathered by time, yet disturbingly fresh. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. I examined the symbol, a cold dread creeping over me. I'd seen similar markings in old books about folklore and ancient rituals. They were warnings, symbols of a place to be avoided, a place where dark things dwelled. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice tight. "But I don't like it." We exchanged a worried look, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Had we stumbled into something we shouldn't have? The symbol on the tree seemed to mock us, a silent testament to our folly. We pressed on, our earlier enthusiasm replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The trail had all but vanished, swallowed by the encroaching undergrowth. We were lost. "I think we should turn back," Emily said, her voice strained. "We've gone too far." "We can't turn back now," I insisted, though doubt not of my confidence. "We're bound to hit the main trail again soon." But as the hours passed, and the forest grew darker, the realization dawned on me: we were hopelessly lost. The compass spun uselessly, the GPS signal lost in the dense foliage. Panic began to rise in my throat. "I told you we should have stayed on the marked trail," Emily said, her voice laced with frustration. "Now what are we going to do?" "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to maintain a calm I didn't feel. "We just need to stay calm and think rationally." But rationality was a luxury we could no longer afford. The sun was sinking lower, casting long, ominous shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The temperature dropped, a chill seeping into our bones. We were alone, lost in a wilderness that seemed to close in around us with every passing minute. "We need to find shelter," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "It's going to get dark soon." We stumbled through the undergrowth, searching for a clearing, a cave, anything that could offer some protection from the encroaching night. Fear gnawed at my insides, a cold, hollow feeling that threatened to consume me. We were no longer adventurers seeking a thrill. We were prey, lost in a hunter's domain. Twilight painted the forest in hues of purple and gray, the last vestiges of daylight fading fast. We finally stumbled upon a small clearing, a patch of bare earth beneath a towering oak tree. Exhaustion weighed heavily on us, our legs aching, our spirits low. "This will have to do," I said, dropping my backpack with a thud. "We need to get a fire going before it gets completely dark." Gathering fallen branches and dry leaves, I fumbled with my lighter, my hands shaking from a combination of cold and fear. After what felt like an eternity, a small flame flickered to life, growing steadily into a comforting blaze. The warmth of the fire offered a small respite from the encroaching darkness, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of dread. We huddled close to the flames, sharing our meager rations. The silence between us was thick with unspoken fears. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sent shivers down our spines. Do you think someone is out there?" Emily whispered, her eyes darting nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight. I forced a reassuring smile. "It's just the wind, Em. Nothing to worry about." But even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, taking on monstrous shapes in the flickering firelight. Every sound, every movement felt like a threat. As the night deepened, the forest came alive with a symphony of unseen creatures. The hooting of owls, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, all sounds that would normally be comforting now seemed ominous, a chorus of unseen eyes watching us from the darkness. Sleep was impossible. We took turns keeping watch, our eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable blackness. Fear gnawed at our insides, a constant companion in the cold, unforgiving wilderness. We were trapped, not just by the forest, but by our own growing terror. Dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and pink, but the light brought little comfort. The forest remained an oppressive presence, its silence broken only by the chirping of birds, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the night. We rose stiffly, our bodies aching from the cold and lack of sleep. The fire had died down to embers, offering little warmth against the morning chill. "We need to find our way back to the trail," I said, my voice hoarse. "We can't stay here." But as we packed up our meager belongings, a sense of unease settled over us. Something felt different. The clearing, once a refuge, now seemed disturbed. "Alex," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." She pointed to the base of the oak tree. The ground was littered with footprints, not our own. They were large, heavy prints, with deep impressions in the soft earth. They weren't the tracks of any animal I recognized. A cold dread washed over me. We weren't alone. Someone, or something, had been here during the night. We scanned the clearing, our eyes searching for any other sign of intrusion. Then, I saw it, a glint of metal nestled amongst the leaves. I cautiously approached, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a knife. A large, hunting knife, its blade gleaming ominously in the morning light. It was clearly not ours. Fear gripped me, a cold, suffocating fear. We were being hunted. Let's continue to develop your thriller writing skills. Crafting a compelling narrative involves not only creating suspense but also pacing the story effectively. In this chapter, we'll focus on increasing the tension while keeping the reader engaged. The knife lay heavy in my hand, a cold, metallic reminder of the unseen danger lurking in the woods. We were no longer just lost, we were prey. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now!" We scrambled to our feet, our movements fueled by adrenaline and fear. We plunged back into the dense undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, thorns tearing at our clothes. We didn't know where we were going, only that we had to get away from that clearing, from the chilling evidence of our pursuer. Hours passed, each one a blur of fear and exhaustion. We stumbled through the forest, our hope dwindling with every step. The sun beat down mercilessly, our water supply running dangerously low. "We need to find water," Emily gasped, her voice hoarse. "I can't go on much longer." We searched desperately for a stream, a spring, any source of water. But the forest remained stubbornly dry, the ground parched and cracked. Desperation clawed at me, a suffocating feeling of helplessness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers. We collapsed onto a bed of moss, our bodies spent, our spirits broken. "We're going to die out here, aren't we?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with despair. I wanted to reassure her, to offer some hope, but the words wouldn't come. I had led us into this wilderness, into this nightmare, and now I was powerless to save us. As darkness enveloped the forest, a new sound reached our ears, a distant, rhythmic chopping, the unmistakable sound of an axe striking wood. Someone was out there, and they were getting closer. The sound of the axe grew steadily louder, each thud sending a fresh wave of fear through us. We huddled together, our bodies trembling, our eyes darting into the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. Suddenly, a light flickered through the trees, a warm, inviting glow that seemed out of place in the oppressive darkness. We cautiously moved towards it, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The light led us to a small clearing, where a ramshackle cabin stood bathed in the glow of a kerosene lamp. Smoke curled from its chimney, a sign of recent habitation. "Should we?" Emily began, her voice hesitant. I nodded, my curiosity outweighing my fear. We needed shelter, and perhaps this cabin held answers, or even help. We approached cautiously, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The door creaked open at our touch, revealing a dimly lit interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a table, and a couple of chairs. A worn rug lay on the floor, and a few pots and pans hung from hooks on the wall. It was a simple dwelling, but it held a strange allure, a sense of both comfort and unease. As we stepped further into the cabin, a sound made us freeze. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the back room. We exchanged a terrified look, our hearts pounding in our chests. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then, the shuffling sound again, closer this time. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt figure with wild eyes and a tangled beard. He held a lantern in one hand, its light casting grotesque shadows on his face. He stared at us, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice rough and gravelly. We opened our mouths to answer, but no words came out. We were trapped, face to face with the unknown, in a cabin that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The old man's eyes burned into us, his silence more menacing than any threat. Instinct took over. We turned and fled, bursting out of the cabin and back into the suffocating embrace of the forest. The darkness swallowed us whole, the trees reaching out like skeletal fingers, their branches whipping at our faces. We scrambled through the undergrowth, our lungs burning, our legs screaming in protest. Behind us, we heard the old man's heavy footsteps pounding the earth, gaining on us with terrifying speed. Fear lent us wings, propelling us forward in a desperate bid for freedom. We crashed through the undergrowth, heedless of the thorns that tore at our clothes and the branches that lashed at our skin. The sound of our pursuers' ragged breathing echoed through the trees, a constant reminder of the danger at our heels. Ahead, a glimmer of moonlight filtered through the trees, revealing a steep, rocky slope. We scrambled up it, our hands grasping at loose rocks and roots, our bodies propelled by sheer adrenaline. The old man's curses echoed behind us, his voice filled with rage and frustration. He was close, too close. We could hear the rasp of his breath, the thud of his boots on the rocks. We reached the top of the slope, our lungs burning, our muscles screaming for respite. Below us, the forest stretched out like a dark, endless sea. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the shadows, grabbing Emily's arm. She screamed, her voice echoing through the night. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The old man stood there, his face contorted in a triumphant grin. Nowhere left to run, he rasped, his voice hoarse. He lunged at Emily, his hand reaching for her throat. I reacted instinctively, throwing myself at him, tackling him to the ground. We rolled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and fury, until we crashed into a thicket of bushes. The fall knocked the wind out of me. I lay dazed, my body aching. The old man sprawled beside me, groaning. Emily knelt beside me, her face pale with fear. "Alex, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I coughed, tasting blood. "I think so," I managed to say. "We need to get out of here." We struggled to our feet, our bodies battered and bruised. The old man lay motionless, his chest rising and falling shallowly. We didn't know if he was unconscious or dead, but we didn't dare stay to find out. We stumbled through the darkness, guided by the faint glow of the moon. The forest seemed to press in on us, its silence broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the trees, blinking in the sudden brightness of the moonlit clearing. A wave of relief washed over us. We had escaped. But our ordeal wasn't over yet. We were lost, injured, and exhausted. We needed help. As if in answer to our prayers, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly making their way towards us. A truck pulled up beside us, its engine rumbling like a comforting beast. A young man stepped out, his face etched with concern. "Are you folks all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. We nodded, tears streaming down our faces. We were safe. The young man helped us into his truck, wrapping us in blankets. He drove us to a nearby town, where we received medical attention and contacted the authorities. The old man was apprehended, his reign of terror in the woods finally brought to an end. We returned home, forever changed by our experience. The wilderness, once a place of adventure and escape, now held a darker significance. But we had survived. We had faced our fears and emerged stronger, our bond forged in the crucible of terror. We had learned that even in the darkest of places, hope can flicker and resilience can prevail. The rusty swing set creaked mournfully in the wind, its chains groaning like old bones. A lone tire swing swayed back and forth, a silent pendulum marking the passage of time in this forgotten corner of the world. The cabin stood hunched in the encroaching darkness, its silhouetted jagged claw against the bruised twilight sky. Alex gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he navigated the final stretch of the treacherous mountain road. He'd been driving for hours, the dense forest pressing in on either side like a suffocating blanket. The GPS had long since lost signal, and the only sounds were the rumble of his Jeep's engine and the insistent whisper of the wind through the pines. He'd come seeking solace, a refuge from the chaos of his life. The cabin, a secluded rental deep within the heart of Smoky Mountain National Park, had seemed like the perfect escape. But now, as he pulled into the overgrown driveway, a prickle of unease danced across his skin. The place had a palpable aura of neglect, of secrets buried deep within its weathered walls. The porch sagged precariously, its wooden planks warped and splintered. A rusty rocking chair sat motionless, as if frozen in time. Alex hesitated, a sudden urge to turn back and flee gripping him. But he pushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar darkness playing tricks on his mind. He grabbed his backpack and duffel bag from the back seat, the weight of them reassuringly familiar. As he approached the front door, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow darted across the window, too quick to be a bird, too large to be a squirrel. He paused, his heart pounding in his chest, but the shadow was gone. With a deep breath, he fumbled for the key the rental agent had given him. It stuck in the lock, resisting his efforts to turn it. He wrestled with it, the metal cold and unforgiving against his palm, until finally, it gave way with a sharp click. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and mildew, a musty odor that clung to the back of his throat. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the grimy windows. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly figures looming in the shadows. Alex stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He set his bags down on the floor and reached for the light switch, but it didn't respond. He tried again, but the room remained stubbornly shrouded in darkness. A shiver ran down his spine. He fumbled for his phone, the screen illuminating his face with an eerie glow. No signal. Of course. He should have expected that. He moved cautiously through the living room, his phone held out like a beacon. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the fireplace was filled with ashes, the remnants of a long-dead fire. A sense of unease settled over him, a feeling that he wasn't alone. He found the kitchen, its counters cluttered with dusty dishes and cobweb-covered utensils. A single window offered a glimpse of the dense forest outside, the trees swaying ominously in the wind. He imagined eyes watching him from the shadows, unseen creatures lurking just beyond the reach of the light. He decided to unpack later. Right now, all he wanted was to find a working light and shake off the creeping sense of dread that had taken hold of him. He climbed the creaking stairs, his footsteps heavy on the worn carpet. The bedrooms were equally dark and dusty. He tried the light switches in each one, but none of them worked. He was about to give up when he noticed a faint glow emanating from under the door of the last bedroom. He pushed the door open, and a wave of cold air washed over him. The room was bathed in an eerie red light, emanating from a crack in the wall. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he saw that the crack was filled with a strange, pulsating substance. It was a deep crimson color, like congealed blood, and it seemed to writhe and shift before his eyes. He reached out a tentative finger to touch it, but a voice inside his head screamed at him to stop. He pulled his hand back, his skin crawling with revulsion. What was that stuff? And where was the light coming from? He took a step back, his eyes darting around the room. And that's when he saw it. A figure huddled in the corner, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, but Alex could feel its eyes fixed on him, burning into him like hot coals. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure remained motionless, a silent sentinel in the crimson gloom. Alex's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a person? Or something else? A low growl rumbled from the corner, and the figure began to rise. Alex stumbled back, his heart pounding in his ears. He had to get out of there. He had to get out now. He turned and fled, his footsteps pounding on the stairs. He burst out of the front door and into the night, the cool air stinging his lungs. He didn't stop running until he reached his Jeep, the engine sputtering to life like a startled animal. As he sped away from the cabin, the red glow from the bedroom window seemed to mock him, a malevolent eye watching his every move. He didn't look back, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would never forget the horrors he had witnessed within those walls. The woods seemed to press closer, the darkness growing teeth. Alex fumbled with his keys, his hand shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine coughed and sputtered, then finally roared to life, the sound a jarring intrusion in the oppressive silence. He slammed the Jeep into gear and tore down the narrow road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle like grasping claws. He didn't slow down until he reached the main park road, the headlights cutting a swathe through the darkness. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the red glow of the cabin pursuing him, but there was nothing but the impenetrable blackness of the forest. He pulled over to the side of the road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, trying to calm his racing heart. What had he seen back there? Was it real, or had his imagination run wild? He thought about calling the park rangers, reporting the strange occurrences at the cabin. But what would he say? That he'd seen a shadowy figure in a pulsating red substance oozing from the walls? They'd probably think he was crazy, or worse, that he was on drugs. He decided to keep it to himself, at least for now. He'd find another place to stay, somewhere less isolated. He'd chalk it up to a bad experience, a creepy night in an old cabin. But as he drove away from the park, the image of the red substance and the shadowy figure lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something sinister, something that he didn't understand. And he couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that he wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. The next morning, Alex woke up in a cheap motel room, the sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. He felt groggy and disoriented, the events of the previous night a hazy nightmare. He tried to convince himself that it had all been a bad dream, but the lingering sense of unease in his gut told him otherwise. He showered and dressed, then headed down to the motel's coffee shop for a much-needed dose of caffeine. As he sipped his coffee, he considered his options. He could go back to the city, admit defeat, and return to his chaotic life. Or he could stay, try to find out more about the cabin and the strange occurrences he'd witnessed. curiosity, and perhaps a touch of stubbornness, won out. He decided to stay. He'd do some research, talk to the locals, see if anyone else had experienced anything strange in the park. He had to know what he'd stumbled onto. He spent the day exploring the nearby town, a quaint little tourist trap with a handful of shops and restaurants. He stopped by the visitor center, hoping to find some information about the history of the park, but the ranger on duty was more interested in selling him souvenirs than answering his questions. He tried the local library, but the only books on the park were filled with pictures of scenic vistas and happy families hiking through the woods. Nothing about mysterious cabins or strange red substances. He was about to give up when he stumbled upon a small bookstore tucked away on a side street. The owner, an elderly woman with a kind face and a twinkle in her eye, seemed genuinely interested in his questions. "You're asking about the old Blackwood cabin, are you?" she said, her voice a low murmur. Alex nodded, surprised that she knew exactly what he was talking about. "It's been abandoned for years," she continued. "There are stories, you know, about that place. Strange things happening, people disappearing." Alex's heart quickened. He wasn't imagining things after all. "What kind of stories?" he asked, leaning closer. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering towards the door. "They say it's cursed," she whispered. "That something evil lives there, something that feeds on the living." Alex shivered, despite the warmth of the bookstore. He thanked the woman and left, his mind reeling. He had a lot to think about, a lot to process. But one thing was clear, he couldn't ignore the mystery of the Crimson Cabin any longer. The old woman's words echoed in Alex's mind as he drove back towards the park. Something evil lives there, something that feeds on the living. He shivered, the air conditioning in the Jeep suddenly feeling inadequate against the chill that had settled over him. He'd initially dismissed the woman's words as folklore, the ramblings of a superstitious local. But after his experience at the cabin, he wasn't so sure. He reached the park entrance and hesitated. The ranger station was just ahead, a small wooden building with a faded Park Service sign. He could stop, report what he'd seen, maybe even convince them to investigate the cabin with him. But he still felt a reluctance, a fear of being dismissed, of being labeled as unstable. He pressed on, the Jeep climbing the winding road towards the secluded corner of the park where the cabin stood. The forest seemed to watch him as he passed, the trees swaying in the breeze like silent observers. He felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that he was being drawn back to the cabin against his will. He reached the clearing and parked the Jeep, his gaze drawn to the ominous silhouette of the cabin against the darkening sky. The swing set still creaked mournfully, the tire swaying back and forth like a macabre metronome. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find inside. He approached the cabin cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The front door stood ajar, a black maw inviting him in. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could turn back, walk away, and never look back. But the curiosity, the need to understand, was too strong. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The musty odor of decay and dampness assaulted his nostrils, making him gag. The interior was shrouded in shadows, the only light filtering through the grimy windows. He fumbled for his phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He moved slowly through the living room, his senses on high alert. The furniture was still draped in sheets, ghostly shapes looming in the corners. He noticed something new, however, a trail of muddy footprints leading from the front door towards the back of the house. He followed the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. The footprints led to a closed door, a faint scratching sound emanating from the other side. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. What was behind that door? Was it the source of the red light, the shadowy figure he'd seen the night before? He took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The scratching sound was louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Alex's skin crawled. He had a bad feeling about this. He descended the stairs cautiously, his flashlight beam illuminating the damp stone walls. The air grew colder as he went deeper, the smell of mildew and decay intensifying. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a small, dirt-floored cellar. The scratching sound was coming from a corner of the room, where a pile of old furniture was stacked against the wall. Alex approached slowly, his flashlight being trained on the shadowy mass. He could make out a shape moving within the pile, something large and shifting. He took another step, and the shape lunged. A snarling, growling creature emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. It was a dog, a massive, emaciated beast with matted fur and razor-sharp teeth. Alex stumbled back, his heart leaping into his throat. The dog snarled again, its teeth bared in a menacing grin. Alex raised his hands defensively, trying to appear non-threatening. "Easy," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog didn't seem to understand. It continued to snarl and growl, its eyes fixed on Alex with predatory intensity. Alex knew he had to get out of there, but the dog was blocking his exit. He glanced around the cellar, searching for a weapon or an escape route. There was nothing but old furniture and cobwebs. He was trapped. The dog lunged again, its jaws snapping shut just inches from Alex's face. Alex cried out and ducked, the dog's teeth grazing his arm. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. He fell backwards, landing hard on the dirt floor. The dog pounced, its weight pinning Alex to the ground. Alex struggled, but the dog was too strong. He could feel the hot breath on his face, the sharp teeth nipping at his throat. He closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But the bite never came. Instead, he heard a sharp crack, followed by a yelp of pain. He opened his eyes to see the dog scrambling back, whimpering. A figure stood in the doorway, a heavy branch clutched in its hand. The figure stepped into the light, and Alex recognized the park ranger from the visitor center. He was holding the branch like a club, his face grim. The dog cowered in the corner, whimpering and licking its wounds. "You okay?" the ranger asked, his voice gruff. Alex nodded, still shaken from his close call. He sat up, his body aching from the fall. The ranger approached cautiously, keeping an eye on the dog. "What were you doing down here?" he asked. Alex hesitated, unsure how to explain his presence in the abandoned cabin. He decided to tell the truth, or at least part of it. "I saw the door open and heard a noise," he said. "I came down to investigate." The ranger nodded, his expression skeptical. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This cabin is off limits." Alex knew he was right. He should have heeded the warnings and stayed away. But now he was here, and he couldn't ignore the strange occurrences he'd witnessed. "I think there's something wrong with this place," he said, his voice low. "Something strange is happening." The ranger raised an eyebrow. "Strange? Like what?" Alex hesitated again. He didn't want to sound crazy, but he couldn't keep his experiences to himself any longer. "I saw a red light coming from one of the bedrooms," he said. "And there was a figure, a shadow, in the corner." The ranger's expression hardened. "A shadow?" he repeated. Alex nodded. It was tall and thin, and it had red eyes. The ranger looked at him for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the dog cowering in the corner. He seemed to be considering something. "Come with me," he said finally. "I need to show you something." The ranger led Alex back up the creaking stairs, the injured dog trailing behind them, whimpering softly. They emerged into the main living area, the dust motes swirling in the shafts of light that pierced through the grimy windows. Alex noticed the ranger's gaze lingering on the muddy paw prints that marred the floor, his expression unreadable. "This way," the ranger said, heading towards the back of the house. He stopped in front of a door Alex hadn't noticed before, its paint peeling and blistered. The ranger grasped the tarnished brass handle and pushed the door open, revealing a small, cramped room. Alex followed him inside, his curiosity piqued. The room was bare except for a single wooden chair and a table covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was the walls that caught his attention. They were covered in strange symbols and diagrams, crudely drawn in what appeared to be charcoal. "What is this place?" Alex asked, his voice hushed. The ranger turned to him, his face grim. "This cabin has a history," he said. "A dark history." He gestured towards the symbols on the walls. "These are ritualistic markings," he explained. "They were used by a cult that lived here many years ago." Alex's eyes widened. "A cult?" The ranger nodded. "They worshipped an entity known as the Crimson One," he said. "They believed it could grant them immortality, but their rituals were unconventional." He paused, his gaze fixed on a particularly disturbing symbol that depicted a figure with outstretched arms and a gaping maw filled with sharp teeth. "They practiced blood sacrifices," he continued, his voice low. "Animals, at first. But then—" He trailed off, leaving the unspoken implication hanging in the air. Alex shivered, the image of the red substance in the bedroom flashing through his mind. He suddenly understood the significance of the dog's injuries. "The dog," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" The ranger shook his head. "No," he said. "It was an offering." Alex felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He'd stumbled onto something far more sinister than he could have imagined. This wasn't just an old abandoned cabin. It was a place of dark rituals and unspeakable horrors. "What happened to the cult?" he asked, his voice trembling. The ranger shrugged. "They disappeared," he said. "Vanished without a trace. Some say they were consumed by the entity they worshipped. Others believe they fled into the woods, driven mad by their rituals." He turned to Alex, his expression grave. "This cabin is dangerous," he said. "You need to leave and never come back." Alex nodded, his mind reeling. He wanted to leave, to put as much distance between himself and this cursed place as possible. But a part of him, a small, stubborn part, couldn't let it go. He had to know more. "What about the red light?" he asked. "And the shadow figure?" The ranger hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the door. "There are things in this world that we don't understand," he said. "Things that defy explanation. This cabin, it's a gateway, a conduit to something dark and ancient." He stepped closer to Alex, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Crimson One still lingers here," he said. "It feeds on fear, on despair. It's drawn to those who are vulnerable, those who are lost." Alex felt a chill run down his spine. He thought about the shadowy figure he'd seen in the bedroom, its red eyes burning into him. Was it the Crimson One? Had it been trying to lure him in, to feed on his fear? "You need to leave," the ranger repeated, his voice firm. "This place will consume you if you stay." Alex nodded again, his resolve crumbling. He knew the ranger was right. He had to get out of there before it was too late. They left the room, the ranger leading the way. As they passed through the living area, Alex noticed something he hadn't seen before, a book lying open on the floor. He picked it up, his curiosity piqued. The book was old and leather-bound, its pages filled with strange symbols and cryptic writing. He recognized some of the symbols from the walls of the ritual room. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the text. "What is it?" the ranger asked, noticing his interest. Alex shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but I think it's important." He tucked the book into his backpack, deciding to study it later. He followed the ranger out of the cabin, the injured dog limping behind them. As they reached the clearing, Alex glanced back at the cabin, its silhouette dark and menacing against the twilight sky. He knew he'd never forget the horrors he'd witnessed within those walls. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Crimson Cabin would continue to haunt his dreams for years to come. The ranger led Alex away from the cabin, the injured dog still trailing behind them. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunching of their boots on the gravel path. Alex's mind was racing, trying to process the disturbing information he'd just received. He glanced at the ranger, who seemed lost in his own thoughts, his brow furrowed and his jaw clenched. "Where are we going?" Alex asked finally, breaking the silence. The ranger stopped and turned to him, his expression grim. "There's something you need to see," he said. "Something that will convince you to leave this place for good." They continued walking, the path leading deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The air grew colder and damper, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig underfoot. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. But it wasn't the tree that caught Alex's attention. It was what lay beneath it. A circle of stones, moss-covered and weathered, surrounded the base of the tree. Within the circle, the ground was churned and disturbed, as if something had been recently buried there. A sense of foreboding washed over Alex as he approached the circle. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, his senses screaming at him to turn back. The ranger stopped at the edge of the circle, his gaze fixed on the disturbed earth. "This is where they found her," he said, his voice low and somber. "Her?" Alex asked, his heart pounding in his chest. The ranger nodded. "A young woman," he said. "A hiker who went missing a few months ago. They found her body here just a few days ago." He knelt down and brushed away some of the leaves and dirt, revealing a patch of dark, crimson-stained earth. Alex's stomach churned. He recognized the color. "The red mold," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The ranger nodded again. "It was all over her," he said. "Growing on her skin, consuming her flesh." Alex felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. The image of the pulsating red substance in the cabin flashed through his mind, and he suddenly understood its true nature. It wasn't just some strange mold, it was something far more sinister, something that fed on the living. "The Crimson One," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's real." The ranger stood up, his expression grave. "It's been here for centuries," he said, "feeding on those who stray too close, those who are vulnerable to its influence." He turned to Alex, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. "You've seen too much," he said. "You've become a target. You need to leave this place, now, before it's too late." Alex nodded, his resolve finally solidifying. He'd seen enough. He'd experienced enough. He wanted nothing more to do with the Crimson Cabin or the entity that resided within its walls. They turned and left the clearing, the ranger leading the way back towards the main path. As they walked, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were following their every move. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking among the trees, but there was nothing but the deepening shadows of the forest. They reached the jeep, and Alex climbed in, eager to put as much distance between himself and the cursed cabin as possible. The ranger stood by the driver's side window, his expression somber. "Don't come back here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Forget about this place. Forget about what you've seen." Alex nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He started the engine, the sound of welcome intrusion in the oppressive silence. He put the jeep in gear and pulled away, the ranger's warning echoing in his ears. As he drove away from the park, the image of the crimson-stained earth beneath the oak tree haunted him. He knew he would never forget the horrors he'd witnessed, the dark secrets he'd uncovered. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Crimson One would continue to linger in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The thing about bears is, they don't need a mask. They're already the stuff of nightmares. Huge, powerful, with claws that could tear you apart like wrapping paper. I was 10 when I first really understood that. It wasn't a nature documentary or a lecture from my dad. It was a horror movie, a grainy, late-night flick with bad acting and buckets of blood. My friend Jake's parents were to let them watch whatever kind, unlike mine. That movie stuck with me, though. Every shadow in my room became a lurking beast, every creak of the house a hungry growl. So, when my family decided on a week-long camping trip to the Smoky Mountains, I wasn't exactly thrilled. My twin sister, Ashley, was all sunshine and excitement, babbling about seeing real bears in their natural habitat. Me? I was picturing that movie bear, its eyes glowing in the dark as it stalked its prey. We set up camp deep in the woods, miles from any ranger station or other campers. Dad, ever the cautious one, laid down the rules: never wander off alone, no food in the tents, and always carry the bear mace. He even had his rifle, more for peace of mind than anything else. Better safe than sorry, he always said. I wasn't about to argue. Even with all the precautions, I still felt a shiver crawl down my spine every time the wind rustled the leaves. Ashley and I had our own small tents, a little distance from the bigger one where Mom and Dad slept. They figured we were old enough to handle it. Independent, they called us. Little did they know I was lying awake every night, listening to every snap and crackle, convinced a bear was sniffing at the thin nylon walls. The days were fine. We swam in the crisp lake, hiked trails dappled with sunlight, roasted marshmallows over the campfire. But as soon as the sun dipped below the trees, the fear would creep back in. The darkness felt thicker here, the silence heavier. I dreaded bedtime, the moment the fire died down and the woods were plunged into inky blackness. One afternoon, we were exploring a trail around the lake. Ashley, the future zoologist, was chattering about animal tracks. "Look, Alex," she said, pointing at a set of prints in the soft earth. "Bear tracks." Mom said black bears are common around here. I felt a jolt of fear. "Come on, Ash," I urged. "Let's get out of here." She was oblivious, kneeling down for a closer look. "These are weird, though," she said, frowning. "They're only the back paws." Like it was walking upright. I stared at her. Walking upright? She laughed. "Yeah, I know, right? Like a cartoon character." But I didn't laugh. A cold, prickly feeling settled over me. Something wasn't right. We made our way back to the lake, where Mom and Dad were relaxing on the shore. I told them about the tracks, but they didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just a regular bear," Dad said, taking a swig of his iced tea. "Nothing to worry about." Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one who'd seen that horror movie. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered like a shadow. I kept replaying Ashley's words in my head, walking upright. It just felt wrong. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the campsite, we were gathered around the campfire. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Dad was telling one of his corny ghost stories, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing into the darkness, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. When it was time for bed, the fear returned with a vengeance. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. An owl hooted in the distance, a twig snapped nearby. My imagination ran wild. Every sound was a footstep, every shadow a monster. Then I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound outside my tent. It was slow, deliberate, like something heavy was dragging across the ground. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The shuffling stopped. Silence. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to fall asleep. But the fear was a cold fist clenched around my throat. I had to see. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow on the clearing. And there, just beyond the circle of light, stood a figure. It was tall and imposing, its silhouette shrouded in darkness. But even in the dim light, I could make out its shape. It was a bear. But not any bear I'd ever seen before. This bear was standing on its hind legs, its arms hanging loosely at its sides. Its head was strangely elongated, its snout narrow and pointed. And its eyes were fixed on me, burning with an unnatural intensity. I gasped, scrambling back into the tent. Zipping it closed, I curled into a ball, my body trembling. What was that thing? I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bear, its grotesque face and those burning eyes. The image was seared into my brain. Morning came, and with it a fragile sense of relief. Sunlight seemed to push back the shadows, making the woods less menacing. But the fear still lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for another chance to strike. We spent the day by the lake, but I couldn't relax. I kept scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Ashley, bless her oblivious heart, was back to her usual cheerful self, splashing in the water and building sandcastles. But I couldn't join in. I was trapped in a nightmare, even with the sun shining down. As evening approached, the dread returned. I pleaded with my parents to leave, to pack up and go home. But they just laughed it off. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you, Alex," Mom said. It was probably just a regular bear. They can look strange in the dark. But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a regular bear. It was something else, something unnatural. That night, I made sure my flashlight was within reach. I lay in my tent, the darkness pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket. The usual forest sounds, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves, were absent. It was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying campfire. Then I heard it again. That slow, shuffling sound, closer this time. It was right outside my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shuffling stopped. A moment of tense silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, a voice, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. I won't starve, it rasped. The voice was deep, guttural, inhuman. It sent shivers of terror down my spine. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I couldn't make a sound. I was paralyzed with fear. The tent flap ripped open. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. But instead of claws and teeth, I felt a heavy pressure on my chest, like something was sitting on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure was gone. I gasped for air, my body trembling. I opened my eyes, but the tent was empty. Had I imagined it? No. There, on the ground, was a single muddy footprint. But it wasn't a bear's paw print. It was a human footprint. A large, bare, human footprint. Panic seized me. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight beam dancing frantically in the darkness. The campfire had dwindled to embers, casting long, eerie shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. But there was no sign of the bear, or the footprint. It was gone. Vanished. I stumbled towards my parents' tent, my heart pounding like a drum. I had to wake them up, tell them what had happened. But as I reached out to unzip the flap, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet, and the trees swayed like drunken giants. I collapsed onto the soft earth, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me whole was a pair of glowing eyes, watching me from the shadows. When I woke, the sun was high in the sky. I was lying in my tent, my head throbbing. My parents were hovering over me, their faces etched with worry. "Alex, are you all right?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. "You were screaming in your sleep. We couldn't wake you up." I sat up, my body stiff and sore. "I saw it again," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "The bear. It was in my tent." My parents exchanged a worried glance. "Alex, honey," Dad said gently, "there was no bear in your tent. You were having a nightmare." "But the footprint." I started to protest. "There was no footprint," Mom interrupted, her voice firm. "You were just dreaming." I wanted to argue, to tell them they were wrong. But the words caught in my throat. They wouldn't believe me. They never believed me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. My parents kept a close eye on me, their concern a suffocating weight. I tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had happened. But the fear was a constant companion, whispering doubts and anxieties in my ear. As the sun began to set, I felt a familiar dread creeping in. I begged my parents to leave, to pack up and go home. But they were adamant. "We're not leaving because of a bad dream," Dad said. "We're going to enjoy the rest of our vacation." I knew it was pointless to argue. They wouldn't listen. So, I resigned myself to another night of terror. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat huddled in my tent, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The woods were silent, eerily so. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. A low growl echoed through the clearing, sending shivers down my spine. The campfire, which had been reduced to smoldering embers, suddenly flared back to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls of my tent. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. Then I saw it. The bear. It was standing just outside my tent, its massive form silhouetted against the flickering flames. Its head was elongated, its snout twisted into a grotesque sneer. Its eyes, those terrifying eyes, burned with an unholy light. "You cannot hide," it growled, its voice a deep, guttural rumble. "I will not be denied." Terror lent me a surge of adrenaline. I scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The bear lunged, its claws outstretched. I dodged, narrowly avoiding its grasp. The chase was on. I sprinted through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The bear was faster, stronger, but I was more agile. I weaved and bobbed, dodging its swipes and lunges. But I couldn't outrun it forever. I stumbled, falling to the ground. The bear loomed over me, its hot breath on my face. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But it never came. Instead, I heard a shriek, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the night. I opened my eyes to see Ashley, standing between me and the bear. She was holding a burning branch from the campfire, its flames licking at the bear's fur. "Leave him alone," she screamed, her voice filled with a ferocity I'd never heard before. The bear hesitated, its eyes flickering between Ashley and me. Then, with a final growl, it turned and lumbered away into the darkness. Ashley rushed to my side, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, still shaken. "I think so," I whispered. We stayed huddled together until dawn, the silence broken only by the crackling of the campfire. When the first rays of sunlight touched the clearing, we made our way back to our parents' tent. They were frantic, having woken to find us gone. Relief washed over their faces when they saw us, safe and sound. But when I tried to explain what had happened, they dismissed it as a shared nightmare. "You were both sleepwalking," Mom said, her voice firm. "It's not uncommon for twins to have similar dreams." I wanted to protest, to tell them about the bear, about the chase, about Ashley's bravery. But I knew it was pointless. They wouldn't believe me. We packed up our things and left the campsite, the memory of that night hanging heavy in the air. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, a shiver running down my spine. I knew, deep down, that the bear was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And I knew that it would be back. The crisp morning air bit at Jenna's cheeks as she hoisted her backpack onto her shoulders. Sunlight filtered through the towering redwoods, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. A thrill of anticipation ran through her. This was exactly the escape she needed. "Ready for an adventure, Jenna?" Chris grinned, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Born ready," she replied, returning his smile. Their friends, Emily and Ben, were busy organizing their gear. Emily, ever the optimist, hummed a cheerful tune as she checked her supplies, while Ben meticulously scrutinized his map, a furrow in his brow. "Just making sure we don't get lost," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Did you guys see that article about those missing hikers? Spooky stuff." A shiver ran down Jenna's spine. She had seen the headlines, but she brushed them off as sensationalism. Now, standing at the edge of the ancient forest, the story suddenly seemed a lot more real. "Don't be such a downer, Ben," Emily chided, slinging her pack over her shoulder. "We'll be fine. We've got Jenna, the wilderness expert, to guide us." Jenna laughed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. "All right, team, let's hit the trail. Redwood National Park awaits." With a surge of adrenaline, they plunged into the depths of the forest, the towering trees swallowing them whole. The air grew cooler and damper, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the trail and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. As they hiked deeper, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. A fleeting shadow in the undergrowth, a twig snapping in the distance. She glanced back at her friends, their faces lit by dappled sunlight, their laughter echoing through the trees. She pushed her anxieties aside. It was probably just her imagination. They were together, they were prepared, and they were going to have an amazing weekend. Or so she thought. Hours melted away as the group ventured deeper into the Redwood National Park. Sunlight dripped through the canopy, painting the forest floor in a mosaic of light and shadow. Towering trunks, some wider than cars, rose like ancient giants, their bark a tapestry of moss and lichen. "This is incredible," Emily exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. "I feel like I've stepped into another world." "It's like something out of Jurassic Park," Chris added, craning his neck to take in the dizzying heights of the trees. Even Ben, ever the pragmatist, seemed to be captivated by the primeval beauty of the forest. He consulted his map, tracing their route with a gloved finger. "We should be approaching Fern Canyon soon," he announced. "It's supposed to be one of the most spectacular sights in the park." Jenna, leading the way, felt a surge of pride. She'd spent months planning this trip, researching the best trails and hidden gems of Redwood National Park. She wanted her friends to experience the same wonder and connection with nature that she felt whenever she was in the wilderness. But as they continued along the path, a sense of unease began to creep in. The trail, which had been well maintained and clearly marked, grew fainter, disappearing at times beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. Jenna noticed footprints that didn't belong to any of them, heavy boot prints that seemed to veer off the path and into the dense undergrowth. "Hey, guys," she called out, her voice tight with apprehension. "Are we still on the right track?" Ben frowned, double-checking his map. "That's strange. According to this, we should have reached the creek by now." A wave of dizziness washed over Jenna. Had they taken a wrong turn? She scanned the surroundings, the towering trees seeming to close in around them. The sunlight was fading, the shadows lengthening, and a chill wind whispered through the branches. "I don't like this," Emily said, her cheerful demeanor fading. "I feel like we're being watched." A twig snapped in the distance, and all four of them froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Was it an animal? Or something else? Jenna forced herself to remain calm. Let's stick together and backtrack. We'll find the trail again. But as they retraced their steps, the feeling of being followed intensified. Whispers seemed to drift on the wind, and shadows danced at the edge of their vision. The forest, once a place of wonder, had become a source of growing dread. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Panic gnawed at Jenna's composure. The forest, once enchanting, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap them. The sun was sinking lower, casting long, ominous shadows that stretched like grasping claws. We need to find our way back to the trail, she said, her voice strained. It's getting dark. Ben, his face pale with worry, pulled out his phone. No signal. And my GPS is going haywire. Mine too, Chris confirmed, his voice tight. It's like there's some kind of interference. Emily, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. Maybe we just need to find a higher spot. Come on, let's climb that ridge. They scrambled up a steep incline, hoping to catch a glimpse of the trail or a landmark that would orient them. But as they reached the top, their hearts sank. All they saw was an endless sea of trees, stretching as far as the eye could see. We're lost, Ben whispered, his voice filled with despair. The realization hit Jenna like a punch to the gut. They were stranded in the heart of Redwood National Park, with no way to contact the outside world and night rapidly approaching. The stories of missing hikers flashed through her mind, fueling her growing fear. We need to stay calm, she said, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. We have supplies, we have shelter, and we have each other. We'll figure this out. But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The temperature was dropping, the air growing thick with an eerie silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. As darkness descended, they huddled together for warmth, their fear a tangible presence in the chilling air. The wind moaned through the branches, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent shivers down their spines. They were not alone. They could feel it. Jenna, her senses heightened, scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. Something was out there, watching them, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The thought sent a wave of terror through her, and she clung to her friends, seeking solace in their shared fear. They were trapped in a nightmare, and the night had only just begun. The faint glimmer of dawn offered little comfort. A thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest in an eerie silence. Jenna, her body stiff and sore from a sleepless night, shivered in the damp cold. Her friends were huddled together, their faces drawn and pale. We need to find shelter, Chris said, his voice hoarse. And a source of water. They set off, moving cautiously through the dense undergrowth. The fog limited their visibility, making it difficult to navigate. Jenna, leading the way, scanned the surroundings, her senses on high alert. She felt like prey, vulnerable and exposed in the predator's domain. After what seemed like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an abandoned campsite, a tattered tent flapping in the breeze, a campfire ring cold and empty. A sense of foreboding washed over Jenna. This place felt wrong. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the stillness. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered her. As they approached the campsite, a gruesome sight met their eyes. A backpack lay ripped open, its contents scattered across the ground. A discarded knife, its blade glinting ominously in the pale light, lay next to a crumpled map. And then they saw it, a dark stain on the forest floor, the unmistakable color of dried blood. "Oh my God," Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ben, his face ashen, knelt down to examine the blood stain. "It's not animal blood," he said grimly. "It's human." A wave of terror washed over Jenna. Someone had been here. Someone had been hurt. And they were still out there. Chris, ever practical, took charge. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But as they turned to leave, a sound stopped them in their tracks. A twig snapped in the distance, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps approaching. Someone was watching them. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The fog swirled around them, concealing their stalker, amplifying their fear. Who was it? What did they want? Jenna felt a surge of adrenaline. They had to run. They had to escape. But before they could make a move, a figure emerged from the mist. Tall and imposing, it stood silhouetted against the pale sky, its features obscured by the shadows. It held something in its hand, something long and sharp that glinted in the faint light. A scream caught in Jenna's throat. They were trapped, and their nightmare had just begun. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in the swirling mist. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She could see the glint of metal in its hand, a hunting knife, its blade long and serrated. "Who are you?" Chris demanded, his voice trembling but firm. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, its silence more menacing than any words. Jenna exchanged terrified glances with her friends. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They turned to run, but the figure lunged, the knife flashing in the dim light. Chris cried out as the blade sliced through his arm. Emily screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a tree root. Chaos erupted. Jenna, fueled by adrenaline, charged at the attacker, landing a solid kick to its shin. The figure stumbled, momentarily distracted, giving Ben the opportunity to grab a fallen branch and swing it with all his might. The branch connected with the figure's head, and it crumpled to the ground with a groan. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. Then, Chris groaned in pain, clutching his bleeding arm. "We need to get out of here," Jenna said, her voice urgent. He could wake up any minute. They fled back into the dense forest, their fear propelling them forward. The fog clung to them, obscuring their vision, making it impossible to see where they were going. They stumbled through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces, thorns tearing at their clothes. As darkness fell, they were forced to stop, exhausted and terrified. They huddled together beneath a giant redwood, its massive trunk offering a semblance of protection. Chris's wound was bleeding profusely, and Emily was sobbing uncontrollably. Ben, his face pale and drawn, scanned the shadows, his eyes searching for any sign of their pursuer. "We need to make a fire," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "We need to stay warm." But their hands were trembling too much to strike a match. Finally, after several attempts, Ben managed to ignite a small flame. They huddled around the fire, its flickering light casting dancing shadows that played tricks on their eyes. Every sound, every rustle in the undergrowth sent their hearts racing. They took turns keeping watch, their eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The night stretched on, an eternity of fear and uncertainty. They were alone in the wilderness, hunted by an unseen enemy. And they knew that their nightmare was far from over. A blood-curdling scream shattered the fragile peace of the night. Jenna's eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. Emily was sitting bolt upright, her face contorted in terror, her gaze fixed on something in the darkness beyond the firelight. "There," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "I saw him. He's back." Panic surged through the group. They scrambled to their feet, their eyes frantically searching the shadows. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on their eyes. Was it just their imagination, or was there really a figure lurking in the darkness, its eyes gleaming with malice? Before they could react, a rock came hurtling out of the darkness, striking Ben on the head. He crumpled to the ground with a groan. Then, the figure emerged from the shadows, the knife glinting in its hand. "Run!" Jenna screamed, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her into the dense undergrowth. Chris, his injured arm throbbing, followed close behind. They crashed through the forest, branches whipping at their faces, thorns tearing at their clothes. The figure was close behind, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth, its ragged breathing echoing through the trees. Jenna risked a glance over her shoulder. The figure was gaining on them, its face a mask of fury in the moonlight. They had to get away. They had to find help. But the forest was a labyrinth, and they were lost in its depths. They stumbled over fallen logs, their feet sinking into the soft earth. The fog swirled around them, disorienting them, making it impossible to see where they were going. Suddenly, Emily cried out, her foot twisting beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her ankle in pain. "I can't go on," she sobbed. "I can't." Jenna knelt beside her, her heart sinking. They couldn't leave Emily behind, but they couldn't stay here either. The figure was closing in, its footsteps growing louder. "We have to carry her," Jenna said, her voice firm. "Chris, help me." Together, they hoisted Emily onto their shoulders, her weight a heavy burden. They staggered on, their legs burning, their lungs screaming for air. But the figure was relentless, its pursuit unwavering. They burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road, their hopes rising. Maybe they could flag down a car, find someone to help them. But the road was deserted, stretching out before them like an endless ribbon in the moonlight. And behind them, the figure emerged from the trees, its knife gleaming in the darkness. They were trapped, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And the chase was far from over. Jenna's lungs burned, Her legs screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. The figure was relentless, its shadow looming behind them like a specter of death. They had to reach civilization, find help, escape this nightmare. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As they rounded a bend in the road, a deep chasm opened up before them, a gaping maw in the earth hidden by the shadows. Chris, his vision blurred by exhaustion and pain, stumbled and cried out as he plunged into the darkness. Jenna and Emily, their grip loosened by the sudden jolt, lost their balance and tumbled after him. Jenna landed with a sickening thud, her body slamming against the rocky ground. Pain shot through her ankle, and she cried out, her voice swallowed by the echoing darkness. She struggled to sit up, her head swimming, her vision blurry. Or were Chris and Emily? Were they hurt? Chris? Emily, she called out, her voice hoarse and weak. Only silence answered her. Panic clawed at her throat. She had to find them. She had to get help. But her ankle throbbed with agonizing pain, making it impossible to put any weight on it. She crawled forward, her hands scraping against the rough terrain, her fingers searching for any sign of her friends. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on her, stealing her breath. She felt utterly alone, abandoned in the depths of the earth. The chilling realization hit her. She was injured, lost, and completely isolated. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't help. She had to be strong. She had to survive. She remembered the wilderness survival skills she'd learned, the importance of staying calm, finding shelter, and signaling for help. But how could she signal for help when she was trapped in this abyss, cut off from the world above? Despair threatened to overwhelm her, but she fought it back. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let fear win. She would find a way out. She had to. With renewed determination, she crawled forward, her fingers tracing the cold, damp walls of the chasm. She had to find a way to climb out, to reach the road, to find help. But the walls were steep and slippery, offering no handholds. Just when she was about to give in to despair, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. Hope surged through her, rekindling her spirit. She had to reach that light. It was her only chance. Driven by a desperate hope, Jenna crawled towards the distant light. Her injured ankle throbbed with every movement, sending waves of pain through her body. But she gritted her teeth and pushed on, fueled by the instinct to survive. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing its source, a flickering lantern hanging from a rusty hook. And beyond the lantern, a structure emerged from the darkness, a small, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls warped and weathered, its windows dark and empty. Relief washed over Jenna. Shelter. A refuge from the cold and the terror that lurked in the forest. She dragged herself towards the cabin, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the uneven ground. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Jenna hesitated, her senses on high alert. Was anyone inside? Was it a trap? But the cold and the fear of being alone in the darkness outweighed her caution. She limped inside, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a rickety table and chairs, a threadbare rug, a rusted wood-burning stove. A sense of unease settled over Jenna. This place felt abandoned, yet there were signs of recent habitation. A half-eaten can of beans sat on the table, a worn blanket lay crumpled on the floor, and a pile of firewood was stacked neatly beside the stove. Someone had been living here, and not long ago. Who were they? And where were they now? Jenna shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She needed to find out who had been staying here. Maybe they could help her, lead her to safety. Maybe they knew something about the figure that was hunting them. She began to search the cabin, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. In a corner, she found a backpack, not unlike the one they had found at the abandoned campsite. Her heart pounded in her chest. Was this the attacker's backpack? She cautiously opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside, she found a collection of unsettling items, a hunting knife, a coil of rope, a pair of night vision goggles, and a tattered journal. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the key to understanding who was terrorizing them. She opened the journal, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. The words swam before her eyes, revealing a chilling tale of isolation, paranoia, and a descent into madness. The writer spoke of being lost in the forest, of being hunted by unseen forces, of a growing obsession with protecting their territory. Jenna's blood ran cold. She was not dealing with a simple hiker or a poacher. She was dealing with someone far more dangerous, someone who had lost their grip on reality, someone who saw every stranger as a threat. And she was trapped in their domain. The cabin door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. Jenna, her heart pounding in her chest, shrank back into the shadows, clutching the journal to her chest. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that distorted the figure's features. But she could see the glint of metal in its hand, the hunting knife. It was him. The man from the journal. The man who had been watching them, hunting them. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of intrusion. Jenna held her breath, praying he wouldn't see her. But then he stopped, his gaze falling on the open backpack and the journal lying on the floor. A snarl twisted his lips, and he lunged forward, his voice a guttural growl. "Who's there?" Jenna knew she couldn't hide any longer. She stepped out of the shadows, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Please," she whispered. "Don't hurt me." The man froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He lowered the knife slightly, but his stance remained tense, his gaze filled with suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough and hoarse. "What are you doing in my cabin?" "My name is Jenna," she said, her voice trembling. "My friends and I got lost in the forest. We didn't mean to trespass." The man's eyes narrowed. "Friends," he sneered. "You're lying. You're one of them. You're here to take my land, to steal my supplies." Jenna shook her head frantically. "No, it's true. We were hiking, and we got lost. Please, you have to believe me." A flicker of doubt crossed the man's face. He glanced at the journal, then back at Jenna. "The journal," he muttered. "You read it." Jenna nodded slowly. I wanted to understand." The man's grip on the knife tightened. "You shouldn't have," he growled. "You shouldn't have seen my secrets." He lunged again, and Jenna screamed, throwing herself to the side. The knife sliced through the air, narrowly missing her. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to get away. Just then, the cabin door burst open, and Chris and Emily stumbled inside, their faces pale and drawn. Chris was still clutching his injured arm, and Emily was limping badly. "Jenna!" Chris cried out. "Are you all right?" The man whirled around, his eyes widening in fury. "More of them!" he roared. "You'll pay for this." He charged at Chris, the knife raised high. Jenna screamed, her voice raw with fear. But before the man could reach him, Emily lunged forward, grabbing a heavy iron poker from beside the stove. With a desperate cry, she swung the poker, striking the man on the side of the head. He staggered, his eyes rolling back in his head, and then collapsed to the floor, unconscious. For a moment there was silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. Then Jenna rushed to Chris's side, her hands checking for any new injuries. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Chris nodded, his face pale but resolute. "I'm fine. We need to get out of here." Emily, her face grim, stood over the unconscious man. "What are we going to do with him?" she asked. Jenna looked at the man, his face contorted in a grimace, his chest rising and falling shallowly. He was dangerous, that much was clear. But he was also clearly disturbed, a victim of his own isolation and paranoia. "We need to tie him up," she said, her voice firm. "And then we need to find help." With the man subdued, a wave of exhaustion washed over Jenna. The adrenaline that had fueled her survival instincts began to fade, replaced by a trembling weariness. She looked at her friends, their faces etched with the trauma of the past few days. Chris's arm was still bleeding, and Emily's ankle was swollen and bruised. They were all injured, exhausted, and emotionally drained. But they were alive. They had survived the ordeal. They quickly worked together, using a rope from the man's backpack to bind his hands and feet. Then, with Chris supporting Emily and Jenna leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a fallen branch, they made their way out of the cabin and back into the forest. The fog had lifted, and the first rays of dawn were painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The sight filled Jenna with a renewed sense of hope. They would find their way out of this wilderness. They would reach safety. They followed the faint trail left by their pursuer, their senses still on high alert. But there was no sign of him. He was gone, lost in the depths of the forest, a victim of his own madness. After what seemed like an eternity, they stumbled out of the trees and onto the dirt road. Relief washed over them like a tidal wave. They had made it. They were safe. A passing truck driver spotted them, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of 3 battered and bruised hikers emerging from the forest. He quickly pulled over, offering them water, food, and a ride to the nearest town. As they drove away from the Redwood National Park, Jenna looked back at the towering trees, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. The forest, once a place of wonder and adventure, now held a darker significance. It was a place of fear, of survival, of a confrontation with the fragility of life. The aftermath of the ordeal was a long and difficult process. Chris's arm required stitches, and Emily's ankle needed to be set in a cast. They all suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, and a lingering sense of unease. But they also found strength in their shared experience. They had faced their fears together, they had fought for survival together, and they had emerged from the darkness together. Their friendship, forged in the fires of adversity, was stronger than ever. Jenna, once an avid hiker and outdoor enthusiast, found herself hesitant to return to the wilderness. The memory of the terror she had experienced lingered, casting a shadow over her love of nature. But she knew that she couldn't let fear control her life. She would heal, she would recover, and she would eventually return to the trails. She would face her fears, and she would reclaim her passion for the wilderness. The Redwood National Park would always hold a special place in her heart, a place of both beauty and terror, a place where she had faced her deepest fears and emerged stronger on the other side. I've lived my whole life in a secluded valley hidden deep within the American heartland. It's so remote, most folks wouldn't even find it on a map. Just a few scattered families and dense, unforgiving woods. No neighborhoods, no sidewalks, and definitely no trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here. It's a test of survival. My family, and the others who've lived here long enough to know better, follow a strict set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition, it's about staying alive. Those who didn't follow the rules, well, they weren't around to tell the tale. These aren't your typical lock your doors and avoid the dark kind of rules. They're specific, born from events we don't discuss, passed down from generations past. My dad always said they originated with my great-grandmother, who brought them with her when she settled in this valley. Whether it's spirits, creatures, or things too ancient to name, Halloween night here has always been a dance with death. Each rule is a fragile shield, a desperate hope to see the dawn. I learned why those rules exist the hard way. The first time I broke one, I witnessed the consequences. It's a night I'll never forget. Every year, around the second week of October, the rules would appear on the fridge, a stark reminder of the danger lurking just beyond our doorstep. We lived by them religiously. My family took them seriously, not just to keep the kids safe, but because breaking one could put us all in jeopardy. Here's how they go. 1. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, don't answer. 2. If you hear a single, hard knock, open the door, but don't look at whoever, or whatever, stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving before shutting the door. 3. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, don't answer. 4. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a white-brimmed hat, don't look at it for more than a second. 5. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, sprinkle salt on all windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. 6. If a candle is burning in the window of the old, abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors, no matter what. These rules weren't arbitrary. They were born from tragedy, disappearances, deaths, and strange occurrences. That's just how it was, and how it always had been. I remember one Halloween years ago. The night fell on a full moon. The air crackled with a strange energy, heavy and oppressive. My dad had a sixth sense for when things were about to go bad. You could feel it in the valley, a palpable dread clinging to the shadows, a cold breath on the back of your neck. Salt the windows now, Dad instructed, his face drawn and pale. We're not waiting for the chains. I obeyed without question, carefully pouring salt along each windowsill and across the thresholds of the front and back doors. My brother, Isaac, was already busy baking bread, anticipating rule number 2, the one we dreaded most. It forced us to interact with whatever lurked on the other side of that door. We never knew what it was, but we knew that refusing the bread, or daring to look, would have dire consequences. By late afternoon, the house was as secure as we could make it. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the kitchen, a fragile attempt at normalcy in the face of the approaching darkness. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, while a 12-gauge shotgun lay across Dad's lap, a grim sentinel against the night. Isaac, ever vigilant, kept glancing out the window, his youthful curiosity battling with a growing sense of unease. 3 hours until sunset. The rules were clear. Everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part, the anticipation gnawing at our nerves. Did we use enough salt this year? Isaac asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dad didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the fire, his grip tightening on the shotgun. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark. A single, slow, deliberate knock that echoed through the silent house. Isaac and I froze, our eyes glued to the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was time to follow rule number 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of warm bread and walked towards the door. Remember, he said, his voice low and steady, don't look. He opened the door just a crack, his eyes fixed on the floor. The warm, yeasty scent of the bread wafted out into the night. I heard a faint shuffling on the porch. Something was out there. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare look. Dad held out the basket, his hand trembling slightly. For a few agonizing heartbeats, there was only silence, then the sound of slow, heavy footsteps retreating into the darkness. He waited until they faded completely before shutting the door and locking it tight. Isaac let out a shaky breath. Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why wait for the knock? Dad's face was pale, his eyes hard. We have to wait. If we don't answer, it'll come in. We thought it was over. We followed rule number 2 to the letter, and for a moment, an eerie quiet settled over the valley. But in this place, on this night, peace was always fleeting. Isaac was the first to notice it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, where the trees met the clearing. Tall and thin, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing its face. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, watching us. "It's him," Isaac gasped, his voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. We all knew. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. Not for more than a second. I glanced, just long enough to confirm its presence. A tall, dark figure, almost blending into the shadows, yet distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. I quickly looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. We retreated to the living room, huddling together in the flickering firelight. Outside, the man in the hat remained at the tree line, an ominous silhouette against the deepening night. It wasn't until after midnight that we heard the chains. A faint metallic clinking at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains dragging across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face paled. "The salt," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up, my legs trembling, and circled the house, inspecting each window and door frame. The salt lines were undisturbed. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer, but we didn't dare open the door, didn't dare look. We stayed inside, huddled together, listening to the chilling sound until the first rays of dawn finally broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone, the chains had fallen silent. But as the morning light filtered through the shutters, I glanced towards the old Anderson cabin up the hill. There it was, a single candle, still burning in the window. The rules are clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions. No excuses. Even with the sun rising and the birds beginning to sing, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal fear. We had to wait until it went out, until the night was truly over. That's how it is here. The rules aren't just guidelines, they're lifelines. And if you're smart, you don't question them. Sometimes, it's better not to know. Halloween in our valley had always been terrifying, but last year was different. It wasn't just the usual unease, the creeping dread that came with the setting sun. It felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older, his movements slower, his hands less steady. We all knew it, but no one dared to say it aloud. We just clung to the rules, hoping against hope that they would hold. We spent the day in the usual frantic preparations, salting the windows, baking the bread. Isaac and I were on edge, double-checking everything, feeling the weight of responsibility as Dad's strength waned. The sky darkened faster than usual, storm clouds gathering in the west, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. By dusk, the fire was burning low, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun resting across his lap. The basket of warm bread sat beside him, its yeasty aroma doing little to comfort us. We waited, hearts pounding, every creak of the house sending shivers down our. My boots crunched on the gravel, the sound a stark contrast to the symphony of birdsong echoing through the towering trees. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the trail ahead. This was it. The first step of my solo through hike on the Appalachian Trail, a journey I'd been meticulously planning for months. A thrill of anticipation coursed through me. This wasn't my first time on the ad, but it was my first attempt at tackling a long stretch alone. I'd always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness, the feeling of self-reliance that came with navigating the rugged terrain and relying on my own wits and preparation. My pack felt reassuringly heavy on my shoulders, filled with everything I need to survive for the next few weeks. I'd spent hours researching the best lightweight gear, poring over online forums and reviews. My tent was a compact, single-person model, my sleeping bag rated for the cool mountain nights, and my water filter promised to keep me hydrated from any stream or spring. I'd even packed a small solar charger for my phone, though I mostly intended to keep it off, embracing the digital detox that came with disconnecting from the world. The air was crisp and clean, a welcome change from the city smog I'd left behind. The Great Smoky Mountains were living up to their name, a bluish haze hanging in the air, giving the distant peaks an ethereal quality. I took a deep breath, savoring the scent of pine needles and damp earth. This was where I belonged, out here on the trail, with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I'd chosen this particular section of the ad for its challenging reputation. It was known for its steep climbs, rocky terrain, and unpredictable weather. But that was part of the appeal. I wanted to test myself, push my limits, and experience the raw power of nature firsthand. As I hiked, I reviewed my planned route, making sure to memorize the key landmarks and water sources. I downloaded offline maps to my phone, just in case, but I preferred to rely on my compass and map reading skills. There was a certain satisfaction in navigating the old-fashioned way, feeling a connection to the generations of hikers who had walked this path before me. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the trail. I decided to start looking for a suitable campsite. I wanted to find a spot near a water source, with enough flat ground for my tent and a good view of the surrounding mountains. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed a small clearing ahead. A stream gurgled nearby, and the ground was covered in a soft carpet of pine needles. Perfect. I set down my pack and began setting up camp, eager to settle in for the night and enjoy the peace and quiet of the wilderness. Little did I know that this tranquility was about to be shattered, and my solo journey would take a turn toward the unexpected and the terrifying. The next morning, I woke to the symphony of birdsong and the warm rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. I emerged from my tent, feeling refreshed and invigorated. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, I packed up my gear and hit the trail, eager to cover some serious mileage. The trail wound its way through dense forests, over rocky streams, and up steep inclines. I fell into a rhythm, my footsteps a steady beat against the earth. The solitude was both comforting and unsettling. I relished the quiet, the absence of human chatter, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the undergrowth, a flash of fur or a rustle of leaves. I knew it was probably just deer or squirrels, but my imagination conjured images of more sinister creatures lurking in the shadows. I reminded myself that I was in a national park, a protected area, and there was nothing to fear. As the day wore on, I started to encounter other hikers. Most were friendly, exchanging brief greetings or sharing trail information. But there were a few who seemed off. One man, with wild eyes and a scraggly beard, muttered something about spirits in the woods before hurrying past. Another, a young woman with a vacant stare, simply ignored me as she walked by, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the trees. I tried to dismiss these encounters as the eccentricities of fellow hikers, but a nagging sense of unease lingered. I heard stories about people disappearing on the At, vanishing without a trace. I'd always considered them urban legends, campfire tales to scare novice hikers. But now, with every strange encounter, those stories seemed to take on a new, unsettling reality. Later that afternoon, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. A tent lay crumpled on the ground, its rain fly flapping in the breeze. A half-eaten bowl of ramen sat on a nearby rock, attracting a swarm of flies. A backpack lay open, its contents spilled out haphazardly. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Was this another missing hiker? Had something happened here? I scanned the surrounding woods, half expecting to see a pair of eyes watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the eerie silence and the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to move on, quickening my pace. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail. I needed to find a new campsite before darkness fell. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I needed to find a campsite soon. The forest was growing darker, and the shadows seemed to lengthen with every step I took. I pushed on, hoping to find a clearing or a level spot near a water source. Just as I was starting to worry about having to set up camp in the dark, I stumbled upon a small stream. It was a welcome sight, its gentle babbling a soothing sound in the growing stillness of the forest. I followed the stream for a short distance, scanning the banks for a suitable campsite. And that's when I saw it. In a small clearing, bathed in the fading light, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a jack-o'-lantern man. 3 pumpkins, stacked one on top of the other, carved with intricate designs and illuminated from within by flickering candles. The top pumpkin had a grotesque face, its grin wide and menacing. The middle pumpkin was carved with a swirling pattern, like flames dancing in the wind. And the bottom pumpkin was adorned with a series of cryptic symbols, their meaning lost on me. I stood there, mesmerized, a chill creeping down my spine. I'd never seen anything like it. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a work of art and a harbinger of something sinister. I reached for my phone, instinctively wanting to capture the image, but hesitated. Something about the figure seemed to warn me against it. Instead, I approached cautiously, drawn in by a morbid curiosity. The pumpkins were real, I could see that now. They were fresh, their flesh still slightly damp, their stems still green. Who would have created such a thing, and why? And how had they gotten them out here, deep in the wilderness? I circled the figure, examining it from all angles. There were no footprints in the soft earth around it, no signs of anyone having been here recently. It was as if it had simply appeared out of thin air. The light was fading fast, and I knew I needed to set up camp. But I couldn't take my eyes off the jack-o'-lantern man. It seemed to be watching me, its glowing eyes following my every move. I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that I was being drawn into something dangerous. Finally, I forced myself to turn away. I found a spot a short distance from the clearing, hidden among the trees. As I set up my tent, I kept glancing back at the figure, its flickering light a beacon in the deepening darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a sign, a warning of something to come. The next morning, I awoke with a start. The image of the jack-o'-lantern man burned into my mind. I emerged from my tent, the morning sunlight doing little to dispel the lingering unease. I quickly packed up my gear, eager to put some distance between myself and the unsettling figure. As I hiked, I couldn't help but scan the woods, half expecting to see another jack-o'-lantern man lurking among the trees. But the trail was empty, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves under my boots. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a prank, some elaborate Halloween decoration left by a group of hikers with a strange sense of humor. Or maybe it was a local artist, creating eerie installations in the wilderness. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something inexplicable. As I continued along the trail, I noticed something strange. Every few miles, I'd come across another jack-o'-lantern man. They were all different, each with its own unique carvings and expressions. Some were grotesque, with leering grins and jagged teeth. Others were more subdued, with sorrowful expressions and downcast eyes. But they all shared one thing in common: they seemed to be guiding me, leading me deeper into the wilderness. At first, I tried to ignore them, sticking to the marked trail. But the figures kept appearing, always just ahead, as if beckoning me to follow. Curiosity, and perhaps a touch of morbid fascination, began to outweigh my apprehension. I started to veer off the main path, following the trail of jack-o'-lantern men. The terrain became rougher, the path less defined. I was venturing into uncharted territory, relying on my compass and instincts to navigate. The forest grew denser, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling of being cut off from the world. Despite the growing sense of unease, I couldn't turn back. I was drawn forward, compelled to uncover the mystery of the jack-o'-lantern men. Who were they? What did they want? And where were they leading me? The trail grew steeper, the air thicker with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I scrambled over rocks and fallen logs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The jack-o'-lantern men continued to appear, always just ahead, their flickering lights guiding me through the deepening shadows. I was now far off the beaten path, venturing into a part of the Great Smoky Mountains few people ever saw. The forest had a primeval feel, the trees towering like ancient sentinels, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sky. I felt a sense of awe mixed with apprehension. This was a place of raw, untamed beauty, but it also held an undeniable sense of danger. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that danced and distorted in the fading light. I knew I should find a place to camp for the night, but I was reluctant to stop. I felt an urgency to press on, as if something was pulling me forward, beckoning me towards an unknown destination. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The hooting of owls, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. I felt a prickle of fear on the back of my neck. I was alone, vulnerable, in a place where humans were merely visitors. I pushed on, my headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. The jack-o'-lantern men continued to appear, their glowing faces seeming to mock my fear. I was starting to question my sanity. Was I really following a trail of carved pumpkins through the wilderness? Or was this some elaborate hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and isolation? I reached for my phone, wanting to check my GPS, to see how far I'd strayed from the trail. But the battery was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it the night before, too caught up in the mystery of the jack-o'-lantern men. Now, I was truly alone, cut off from the outside world, with no way to call for help if I needed it. A wave of panic washed over me. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps and find my way back to the marked trail. But the jack-o'-lantern men seemed to block my path, their glowing eyes urging me forward. I was trapped, caught in a web of mystery and fear, with no escape in sight. The path led me to the edge of a steep ravine. Below, shrouded in mist and moonlight, lay a hidden valley. It was a breathtaking sight, a secret world nestled within the folds of the mountains. But as I gazed down into the valley, a sense of dread washed over me, cold and heavy. The jack-o'-lantern men were there, dozens of them, scattered across the valley floor. Their flickering lights created an eerie spectacle, like a macabre festival of glowing faces. They were arranged in a rough circle, their expressions a mix of menace and sorrow, as if they were both guardians and mourners of some ancient secret. I hesitated at the edge of the ravine, unsure whether to proceed. The valley seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of something ancient and powerful. I felt a primal fear, a deep-seated instinct warning me to turn back. But curiosity, that insatiable drive to understand the unknown, overrode my fear. I began to descend into the valley, picking my way carefully down the steep, rocky path. The air grew colder as I descended, the silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves under my feet. As I reached the valley floor, the jack-o'-lantern men seemed to close in around me, their glowing faces looming in the darkness. I felt a sense of being watched, judged, by unseen eyes. The air crackled with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I walked towards the center of the circle, drawn by an invisible force. The jack-o'-lantern men seemed to part before me, creating a path through their ranks. I felt like an intruder, a trespasser in a sacred space. In the center of the circle, I found a large, flat rock. It was covered in moss and lichen, and a faint glow emanated from its surface. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed against the cold stone, a wave of energy surged through me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The valley seemed to spin around me, the jack-o'-lantern men blurring into a sea of grotesque faces. I felt a presence, vast and ancient, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was no longer alone in the valley. I was surrounded by something powerful, something malevolent. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Panic seized me. I stumbled back from the glowing rock, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The jack-o'-lantern men seemed to close in, their expressions contorted in silent menace. I turned to flee, but the path I had taken was gone, the ravine a sheer wall of rock and shadow. I was trapped. Then, the chase began. The jack-o'-lantern men moved with an unnatural speed, their glowing forms bobbing and weaving through the trees. They were silent, their pursuit relentless, their presence a suffocating weight on my chest. I scrambled through the undergrowth, branches whipping in my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I remembered my years of trail running, the endurance I had built, the agility I had honed. I dodged and weaved, using the trees and rocks as cover. I leaped over fallen logs, splashed through streams, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest. But the jack-o'-lantern men were tireless. They seemed to anticipate my every move, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. I could hear their presence behind me, a rustling, a whispering, a sense of something closing in. I stumbled, falling to my knees. Desperation clawed at me. I was exhausted, my body battered, my spirit broken. I looked up, and there they were, the jack-o'-lantern men, forming a circle around me, their faces a grotesque chorus of silent judgment. But just as I thought all hope was lost, a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't let these things win. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around, searching for an escape. And then I saw it. A narrow opening in the circle of jack-o'-lantern men, a gap in their ranks. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble, but it was my only hope. I took a deep breath and lunged forward, bursting through the opening, my body a projectile launched into the darkness. I burst through the gap in the circle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I didn't look back, didn't dare to slow down. I scrambled through the trees, branches whipping in my face, my lungs burning with the effort. The sounds of the valley faded behind me, replaced by the pounding of my own heart and the ragged gasps of my breath. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, exhaustion forced me to slow down. I collapsed onto a bed of moss, my body trembling, my mind reeling. I had escaped the valley, but the experience had left an indelible mark on me. As I lay there, catching my breath, I tried to make sense of what had happened. What were the jack-o'-lantern men? Where had they come from? And what did they want? I thought back to the stories I'd heard about the Appalachian Trail, the legends and folklore that surrounded it. There were tales of strange creatures, of lost hikers, of places where the veil between worlds was thin. Could the jack-o'-lantern men be some kind of guardians, spirits of the forest protecting a sacred place? Or were they something more sinister, malevolent entities feeding on fear and despair? I didn't have any answers. But I knew one thing, I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I had to learn more about the jack-o'-lantern men, about their origins and their purpose. As I rested, I noticed a faint glow emanating from my backpack. I reached inside and pulled out a small, carved wooden figure. It was a gift from my grandfather, a Cherokee medicine man, who had taught me about the spirits of the forest and the importance of respecting the natural world. I held the figure in my hand, its smooth surface warm against my skin. I thought of my grandfather's words, "The forest has a spirit, a consciousness. It watches over us, guides us, protects us. But it also demands respect. If we trespass on its sacred grounds, if we disrespect its power, it will retaliate." I realized then that the jack-o'-lantern men were not just guardians of the valley. They were a manifestation of the forest itself, a warning to those who dared to trespass on its sacred grounds. I had ventured into a place where I didn't belong, and I had been punished for my arrogance. I knew then what I had to do. I had to find a way to appease the jack-o'-lantern men, to show them that I respected their power and understood my transgression. I had to find a way to make amends. The carved wooden figure felt warm in my hand, a comforting weight against the fear that still clung to me. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind, reminding me of the deep connection between humans and the natural world, a connection I had forgotten in my pursuit of adventure and challenge. I looked around at the towering trees, the mossy rocks, the whispering wind. The forest was not just a collection of plants and animals. It was a living entity, a powerful force that deserved respect. I had violated that respect by venturing into the valley, by seeking to uncover its secrets without understanding its power. I knew I couldn't simply apologize to the jack-o'-lantern men. They were not individuals, but manifestations of the forest spirit, its guardians and protectors. To appease them, I needed to offer something meaningful, something that demonstrated my understanding and remorse. I thought about what my grandfather had taught me about the Cherokee traditions, about the importance of giving back to the earth, of honoring the spirits of the land. An idea began to form in my mind, a way to offer a sacrifice that was not about material value, but about symbolic meaning. I reached into my backpack and pulled out my knife. It was a simple tool, but one that I valued greatly. It had been a gift from my father, a reminder of the many camping trips we had taken together, of the skills he had taught me, of the love of the outdoors that he had instilled in me. With a heavy heart, I knelt on the ground and began to carve. I worked slowly and deliberately, channeling my emotions into the wood, my fear, my regret, my newfound respect for the forest. I carved a small figure, a representation of myself, kneeling in humility, offering a gift to the spirits of the land. When I was finished, I held the figure in my hand, admiring its simple beauty. It was not a perfect work of art, but it was imbued with my sincerity, my desire to make amends. I placed the figure on the ground, at the base of a towering oak tree, a symbol of my surrender, my acknowledgement of the forest's power. As I stood there, a sense of calm washed over me. The fear that had gripped me for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a feeling of peace and acceptance. I had made my offering, and now it was up to the forest to decide whether to accept it. A sense of peace settled over me as I stood before the ancient oak, the carved figure a testament to my newfound respect for the wilderness. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind whispering through the trees with a gentler touch. I waited, unsure of what to expect, my heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Then, a subtle shift occurred. The air grew lighter, the shadows less menacing. I felt a sense of release, as if the forest had accepted my offering, acknowledged my remorse. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me lifted, replaced by a feeling of renewed energy and purpose. I turned and began to retrace my steps, my pace quicker now, my heart lighter. The jack-o'-lantern men were gone, their presence replaced by a sense of watchful benevolence. The forest seemed to guide me, the path appearing clearer, the obstacles less daunting. As I climbed out of the ravine, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. I emerged from the forest, blinking in the sudden brightness, feeling as if I had been reborn. I made my way back to the Appalachian Trail, my footsteps echoing on the familiar path. I passed other hikers, their faces filled with the joy of adventure and the anticipation of the day ahead. I smiled at them, a silent acknowledgement of our shared connection to the wilderness. But I knew that my experience had changed me. I would never again take the forest for granted, never again underestimate its power. I would carry with me the lessons I had learned, the respect I had gained, the understanding that the wilderness was not just a playground for human amusement, but a sacred space deserving of reverence and care. I continued my hike, my journey now imbued with a new sense of purpose. I would share my story with others, warn them of the dangers of venturing off the trail, of disrespecting the power of the forest. But I would also share the beauty I had witnessed, the peace I had found, the transformative power of connecting with the natural world. The Appalachian Trail stretched out before me, a winding ribbon of adventure and discovery. I took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air, the feeling of the earth beneath my feet. I was ready to continue my journey, not as a conqueror of the wilderness, but as a humble student eager to learn its secrets and protect its wonders. The crisp autumn air whipped through my hair as I wrestled with the tent poles, the excitement bubbling inside me threatening to spill over. Mark, ever the optimist, was already humming cheerfully as he unpacked our gear. This was it, our escape from the soul-crushing monotony of deadlines, overflowing inboxes, and the endless scroll of social media. A whole week of pristine wilderness in the Ozarks National Forest stretched before us, a digital detox in the heart of Arkansas. I couldn't wait to trade the glow of my laptop for the flickering light of a campfire and swap the city soundscape for the symphony of nature. Of course, no adventure is complete without sharing it with the world. I snapped a quick selfie with Mark, the vibrant fall foliage serving as our backdrop, and uploaded it to Instagram with the caption trading spreadsheets for Esmores. Hashtag Ozark Adventure, hashtag Camping Life, hashtag Nature Vibes. Gotta keep those followers engaged, even when you're off the grid. We'd chosen the Ozarks for its reputation as a hiker's paradise, promising miles of secluded trails and breathtaking scenery. Our destination, a hidden gem of a campsite nestled deep within the forest, far from the crowded tourist traps. As we shouldered our packs and set off on the trail, a sense of anticipation mingled with a prickle of unease. The forest seemed to close in around us, the towering trees casting long, eerie shadows that danced in the dappled sunlight. A few miles in, we encountered a lone figure leaning against a weathered signpost. Ranger Bill, his name tag proclaimed, with a face etched by years of sun and wind. He eyed us with a gruff curiosity, his gaze lingering a little too long on our somewhat inadequate camping gear. Heading deep in, are you? He drawled, his voice thick with a southern accent. Best stick to the marked trails. These woods can be tricky, especially for city folk. He offered a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, then added, and if you hear any strange noises at night, well, just ignore him. It's probably just the wind. His words hung in the air as we continued on our path, a shiver of apprehension running down my spine. Just the wind, he said. But somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more lurking in the shadows of the Ozarks. The trail grew steeper and more rugged, our boots crunching on fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. The sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above cast an otherworldly glow, painting the surroundings in shades of emerald and gold. I paused to capture the breathtaking scenery with my phone, adding another post to our hashtag Ozark adventure. Lost in the beauty of the wilderness. I typed, attaching a picture of a moss-covered waterfall cascading over rocks. Little did I know how literal those words would become. As we ventured deeper, the comforting sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant caw of a crow. The signal bars on my phone dwindled and then vanished altogether. No service, I announced, a twinge of anxiety creeping into my voice. Mark, ever the pragmatist, simply shrugged. No distractions then. Just us and nature. He held up our trusty GPS device. Besides, we've got this to guide us. We'll be fine. I tried to quell the unease swirling in my stomach. We planned this trip meticulously, studying maps, packing extra supplies, and informing friends about our itinerary. Still, the sudden isolation was unsettling. The forest seemed to press in on us, an endless expanse of trees stretching towards our horizon shrouded in mist. After what felt like hours of trekking, we stumbled upon a clearing. A fire pit ringed with stones, a dilapidated picnic table, and a tattered tent flapping forlornly in the breeze, the remnants of an abandoned campsite. A chill ran down my spine. Who would leave their belongings behind in such a remote location? Maybe they just forgot something and had to rush back, Mark offered, sensing my apprehension. But his voice lacked conviction. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The air hung heavy with an unspoken story, a sense of something left unfinished. As we set up our own tent a safe distance away, I couldn't help but scan the surrounding woods, searching for clues, for answers, for anything that might explain the unsettling aura of this forgotten place. Nightfall descended upon the Ozarks, draping the forest in an inky blackness that seemed to swallow all light and sound. The campfire crackled and hissed, casting flickering shadows that danced on the surrounding trees, their skeletal branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I huddled closer to the flames, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The silence was unnerving. The usual symphony of crickets and frogs was strangely absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that amplified every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like unseen eyes were watching our every move from the depths of the forest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, clutching Mark's arm. He strained his ears, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" "It's just the wind." But it wasn't just the wind. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps treading lightly on the forest floor. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with alarm. I grabbed the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing but the dense undergrowth. "There's someone out there," I insisted, my voice trembling. "I know it." Mark, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize. "Maybe it's an animal, a deer or something." But deep down, I knew he was just trying to reassure himself as much as me. The footsteps continued, circling our campsite, always just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. We stayed huddled by the fire, fear gnawing at our insides, until the first rays of dawn finally pierced the darkness. Exhausted but unable to shake off the feeling of dread, we packed up our gear and decided to relocate. Maybe a change of scenery would ease our growing paranoia. But as we set off, I couldn't help but glance back at the trees, half expecting to see a pair of eyes watching us from the shadows. The feeling of being watched, hunted, persisted, casting a dark cloud over our once promising adventure. Dawn broke, casting a pale light over the campsite. The events of the previous night hung heavy in the air, the lingering fear a tangible presence. We decided to move on, hoping to find a more secure location, a place where the oppressive sense of being watched wouldn't weigh so heavily on our minds. But as we emerged from the tent, a wave of disbelief washed over me. Our food supplies, carefully stored in a bear-proof container, had been raided. The lock was mangled, the contents scattered across the ground. Empty wrappers and crumbs littered the area, evidence of a midnight feast. "What the?" Mark stared in disbelief, his voice a mixture of confusion and anger. "Who would do this?" We scanned the surrounding area, searching for any sign of the intruder. A set of footprints, clearly visible in the damp earth, led away from the campsite, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. But they weren't our footprints. These were larger, heavier, with a distinct tread pattern that didn't match any hiking boots I'd ever seen. A cold dread gripped my heart. We weren't alone in these woods. Someone, or something, was watching us, toying with us. Mark fumbled with the GPS device, his frustration growing as the screen flickered erratically. "Damn it! The GPS is malfunctioning," he cursed, his voice tight with panic. "I can't get a signal." Panic started to rise in my chest. Lost, with no way to communicate and a mysterious intruder lurking nearby, we were stranded in the heart of the wilderness. As I frantically searched for a solution, my eyes fell on something glinting in the branches of a nearby tree. A small, black object, almost camouflaged against the bark. My blood ran cold. It was a trail camera, its lens pointed directly at our campsite. We had been watched, our every move recorded. But by whom? And why? The discovery of the trail camera sent a shockwave of fear through me, turning the unease of the past few days into full-blown panic. We were no longer just isolated. We were being watched, monitored, hunted. But by whom? And why? "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Now!" Mark, usually the calm and collected one, was now pale and shaken. "But the GPS, we're lost. Which way do we go?" "It doesn't matter," I urged, my instinct screaming at me to flee. "Any direction is better than staying here." We argued, our voices rising in the tense atmosphere. The fear was a wedge between us, eroding the trust and camaraderie we'd shared just days before. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential signal of our unseen observer. Finally, we decided to follow the mysterious footprints. It was a desperate gamble, but it offered a glimmer of hope, a potential path towards answers, towards whoever was responsible for this terrifying ordeal. The trail led us deeper into the wilderness, the forest growing denser, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. We stumbled over gnarled roots and fallen branches, our progress slow and agonizing. As we pressed on, I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of the trees. Crudely etched figures, circles with crosses inside, and other markings I couldn't decipher. They were unsettling, like ancient warnings or territorial claims from something sinister. The sense of dread intensified with every step. We were venturing further into the unknown, into a territory where the rules of civilization no longer applied, where something dark and primal held sway. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. We weren't just lost, we were being hunted. The footprints weren't a path to safety, they were a lure, drawing us deeper into the clutches of whoever, or whatever, was stalking us. Panic surged through me, a primal fear that sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. I grabbed Mark's hand, pulling him along, our pace quickening from a cautious trek to a desperate flight. We scrambled through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, thorns tearing at our clothes. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the heavy thud of footsteps closing in. Our unseen pursuer was relentless, their presence a suffocating weight on our backs. Mark stumbled, crying out in pain as his ankle twisted beneath him. He fell to the ground, his face contorted in agony. I can't go on, he gasped, clutching his injured ankle. Despair threatened to consume me. We were trapped, cornered like prey. But the sounds of pursuit were getting closer, leaving us no time to despair. We have to keep moving, I urged, hauling him to his feet. We can't stop now. We limped on, our progress agonizingly slow. The forest seemed to conspire against us, the trees closing in, the branches reaching out like grasping claws. The shadows lengthened, twisting into monstrous shapes that played tricks on our exhausted minds. The sounds of our pursuer were now close behind us, a terrifying symphony of heavy breathing and guttural growls. I could almost feel their hot breath on my neck, their presence a tangible terror that spurred us onward. We were running out of time, running out of options. The forest held us in its grip, a labyrinth of fear with no escape in sight. Just as our strength was failing and the sounds of our pursuer were almost upon us, a flicker of light pierced the gloom. Through the dense trees, we glimpsed a faint glow, a beacon of hope in the deepening despair. With renewed determination, we stumbled towards the light, our bodies aching, our lungs burning. The undergrowth thinned, giving way to a small clearing. In the center stood a ramshackle cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. We didn't hesitate. We burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind us, our hearts pounding like drums. We had found sanctuary, a temporary respite from the terror that lurked in the woods. The cabin was small, with a single room and a loft. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that streamed through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. A fireplace dominated one wall, a pile of logs stacked neatly beside it. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and a faded rug lay on the floor. Despite the rustic appearance, there were signs that someone had been living here recently. A half-eaten bowl of stew sat on the table, a spoon resting in it. A book lay open on a nearby chair, a pair of reading glasses perched on the page. A faint scent of wood smoke lingered in the air. Curiosity battled with fear as I explored the cabin. In a corner, I found a stack of newspapers, their headlines screaming about missing hikers and unexplained disappearances in the Ozarks. A chill ran down my spine. Was this cabin a refuge or a trap? Suddenly, a sound from outside shattered the silence. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path, approaching the cabin. Voices murmured, low and menacing. Our sanctuary was about to be invaded. The cabin door creaked open, and 3 figures loomed in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light. They were clad in camouflage gear, their faces obscured by hunting masks. Each held a rifle, their barrels glinting ominously in the dim light. Well, what do we have here? A gruff voice rasped. Looks like we got ourselves some trespassers. Fear coiled in my stomach. These weren't rescuers. These were something far more sinister. We were just seeking shelter, I stammered, raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. We got lost. The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. One of them stepped forward, his rifle raised. Lost, huh? That's a shame. This here's private property. You know the penalty for trespassing? Mark stepped in front of me, his voice shaking but defiant. We didn't see any signs. We just needed a place to stay for the night. The man chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed through the cabin. Signs? We don't need signs. This is our territory. And you're in it. He gestured with his rifle. Now, why don't you two come on out here? We need to have a little chat. I exchanged a terrified look with Mark. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But something in the men's demeanor, a glint of cruel amusement in their eyes, told me this was more than just a territorial dispute. As they advanced, I noticed something strange. One of them held a small video camera, its red light blinking. He was filming us, capturing our fear. Suddenly, a horrifying realization dawned on me. These weren't just hunters. They were something far more twisted, something that thrived on fear and suffering. They were playing a game, and we were the unwilling participants. The hunter with the camera gave a twisted grin. You're right, he cackled. This is more than just trespassing. It's about the thrill of the hunt. The fear in your eyes, it's intoxicating. He gestured towards the camera. We're live streaming this, you know. Got a whole audience out there watching your every move. They love this stuff. The more scared you are, the more they pay. My blood ran cold. We had stumbled into a nightmare, a real-life horror show broadcast for the entertainment of twisted individuals lurking in the darkest corners of the internet. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, his voice filled with rage. "What kind of sick game is this?" The hunter shrugged. "We're just ordinary folks. Got jobs, families. But we need a little excitement in our lives, you know? Something to break the monotony." He raised his rifle. "And you two are providing that excitement." They herded us outside, the camera following our every move. The night was alive with the sounds of the forest, but now every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed to amplify our terror. They forced us to walk, pushing us deeper into the woods. We stumbled through the darkness, our bodies bruised and battered, our minds reeling from the horror of our situation. But as we walked, I noticed something. The hunters were growing careless, their attention focused on the camera, on the thrill of the chase. They were so consumed by their own twisted game that they weren't paying attention to their surroundings. An idea began to form in my mind, a desperate plan fueled by adrenaline and fear. It was a long shot, but it was our only chance. The hunter with the camera stumbled, his attention glued to the screen as he navigated the uneven terrain. It was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. With a surge of adrenaline, I shoved him hard, sending him sprawling to the ground. The camera clattered away, its lens cracking on a rock. Mark, seizing the moment, lunged at the nearest hunter, tackling him to the ground. A chaotic struggle ensued. We fought with a ferocity born of desperation, kicking, scratching, biting, using every ounce of strength we could muster. The hunters, caught off guard, were slow to react, their arrogance turning to panic as the power dynamic shifted. I managed to wrestle a rifle away from one of them, my finger trembling as I fumbled with the safety. A shot rang out, echoing through the trees. The hunter clutching his leg, howling in pain. The remaining hunter, his eyes white with fear, turned and fled into the darkness. We didn't pursue him. We just ran, our lungs burning, our legs aching, but our hearts filled with a desperate hope. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, stumbling out onto a gravel road. A passing truck driver, alerted by our disheveled appearance and frantic pleas, called the authorities. The police arrived, followed by an ambulance. We were taken to a local hospital, our bodies battered, our minds traumatized. The hunters were apprehended, their twisted game exposed to the light of day. The dark web forum they used to broadcast their hunts was shut down, its members scattered back into the shadows. But the scars of our ordeal remained. The feeling of being watched, hunted, lingered long after we returned home. The sounds of the forest, once a source of tranquility, now echoed with the terror of that night. I struggled to cope with the aftermath, the memories haunting my dreams. Therapy helped, but the fear remained, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of humanity. I still hike, but I never stray from the marked trails. The wilderness holds a different kind of beauty now, a beauty tinged with caution and respect. And every time I see a trail camera, a shiver runs down my spine, a chilling reminder of the night we became the prey in a twisted game of survival. The crisp mountain air of Montana was a far cry from the humid streets of Miami, but it was exactly the change I craved. My best friend, Marcus, and I had decided to ditch our dead-end jobs and head west for a fresh start. I landed a gig teaching history at a high school near Butte, and we found an incredible rental, a sprawling Victorian mansion nestled deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. The place was perfect, secluded, affordable, and steeped in a history that whispered from the antique furniture and faded portraits lining the walls. But there was an unsettling undercurrent to our idyllic new home, a sense of unease that clung to the shadows. Our landlord, a grizzled, imposing man named Jedediah Jed Stone, warned us about the occasional power outages and the strict rules regarding the property. One rule in particular stood out: the basement was off limits. The first night alone, after Marcus left for his 2-week shift at a drilling site, the power went out. An eerie silence descended, punctuated by the unsettling sound of scratching coming from downstairs. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but curiosity won. With my phone as my only light source, I crept towards the basement door. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then, my phone died. Plunged into darkness, I fumbled for the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, a blinding light pierced the darkness. It was Jed, holding a lantern. He claimed to be fixing the fuse box, but his presence was unnerving. I pointed up the deep red claw marks on the wall, but he dismissed them as mold. The next day, I sent a picture of the strange mold to my other best friend, David, a brilliant biologist back in Miami. He was intrigued and asked me to mail him a sample. Days later, David called, his voice laced with disbelief and anger. He hadn't received mold, he'd received human blood. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more frantic. The red marks on the basement door seemed to writhe and drip. Whispers echoed from behind the door, chilling me to the bone. Driven by a force I couldn't explain, I grabbed a hammer and smashed the padlock. The sight that greeted me was horrifying. The stairwell was covered in bloody claw marks. The scratching and whispers were coming from behind the wall. I tore down the drywall, revealing a gruesome scene. Bodies, their faces contorted in fear, were entombed within the walls. One of them was a woman with familiar cold, gray eyes, Jed's eyes. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my side. Jed's voice, a chilling whisper, sent shivers down my spine. "Looks like you'll be joining them." He threw me down the stairs, and I blacked out. When I awoke, I was covered in blood, the basement engulfed in an eerie red glow. Jed was patching the wall, oblivious to my presence. Just then, Marcus walked in, his cheerful voice echoing through the house. Jed lunged at him with a knife, and I screamed a warning, but it was too late. Marcus fought back, but Jed was relentless. In the ensuing struggle, a lantern shattered, setting the living room ablaze. Marcus, mortally wounded, mouthed a single word: "Run." As the flames spread, I heard the scratching again. This time, I understood. It was Morse code, spelling out the same desperate message: "Run." Jed, his face obscured by blood, turned towards me. I grabbed the discarded hammer and swung with all my might, connecting with his jaw. He crumpled to the floor. I crawled out of the burning house, leaving Jed and Marcus behind. The flames consumed the mansion, its secrets turning to ash. The police investigation revealed multiple bodies within the ruins, but Jed's remains were never identified. I returned to Florida, haunted by the horrors I witnessed. Even now, I sometimes see fresh red mold in my basement and hear the faint scratching in the night. The message from the other side remains the same: run. But I'm not running anymore. I'm waiting.